Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from just outside of Washington, D.C., the capital of the infected states of America. In the Interdependent Corner, I am investigative analyst and political theorist Shane Stranahan.
And in the lefty corner, I am agitated, slightly annoyed at the death toll, lefty, Jamal Thomas.
Get ready for the show that is the antidote to propaganda. We're both anecdotal and fond of data. It's Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, going first up into headlines this morning. In the news, in the USA, let's start off with this. We have 41,000 new coronavirus cases confirmed. We also have more than 2,500 deaths in the last day. This is a huge uptick from recent weeks. If you remember, deaths had gotten down to the low hundreds. Now, again, they're back up to the mid-2000s. That was near the peak that we saw a few months ago. Democrats have passed a huge policing reform bill in the House. That bill was submitted by the Congressional Black Caucus. That bill will be going to the Republican-led Senate. Many suspect it will fail there. The Trump administration has asked the Supreme Court to overturn the ACA, also known as Obamacare, with an 82-page document. The DOJ said the act became invalid when the previous Republican-led Congress passed a law that would prohibit individuals from being fined for not having health care. Some 40 million Americans may be affected. They could lose their health care as a result of the Supreme Court decision. The head of the CDC says COVID cases may be 10 times higher than expected. This also comes as the CDC has expanded the list of underlying conditions that could put someone at risk of illness, of serious illness, after contracting COVID-19. That includes the new conditions would include type 2 diabetes. They're definitely stressing obesity and pregnancy. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled in favor of Trump that asylum seekers will not have a right to a federal court hearing. This will make the whole asylum situation in the United States a much harder process to navigate. A huge drop in humanitarian funding has a UN agency warning that millions of children in Yemen could be pushed to starvation over the coronavirus pandemic. There are currently 2.4 million malnourished children in Yemen. That is currently the world's worst humanitarian crisis. I want to talk about that a little bit later. And last but not least, we have research that was carried out in Italy and Tunisia suggesting the presence of microplastics in commonly eaten types of fruit and vegetables, with apples the fruit most affected and carrots the vegetable most affected. This new research is the first research to show the presence of microplastics in vegetables. Previously, microplastics had been identified in fish and crustaceans, but again, this is now microplastics coming into the sphere of animal life. 3 members of the Wilmington, Delaware Police Department, Corporal Jesse Moore and officers Kevin Piner and Brian Gilmore, were fired on Tuesday after a department audit exposed a disturbingly sad and hateful video of commentary between the co-workers where they designated an African-American magistrate I'm actually not going to say that, a word that I don't want to say, in addition to a gay slur. Nice to know they weren't just racist. And you know what? I'll end it there. You're all caught up with the headlines. That's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So, Jamal, what's on the queue for today?
Well, Shane, I am phenomenally glad you asked. You know, sometimes words can go unspoken and yet heard in sublime and profound ways. And this is in part why I think I'm so adamant about supporting the protests. Shane, if you lived in New York's 16th district, I won't ask your age. We got to get a better picture of you. People in the chat think you're in your teens. That's all right. We're going to keep you mysterious. Women throw themselves at brilliant, contemplative men doing the news. I assume my wife puts up with my infatuations for some reason. But if you were kicking around in New York's 16th, 17th, and 18th district going back to the late 80s and 90s, you may be forgiven for believing that Representative Eliot Engel was a force of the universe. The political equivalent of a weak nuclear force, absolute and ever-present like time itself, constant like the magnificent beat of my own heart. I'm trying to make the point that he seemed eternal. In no way should you admonish yourself if the veracity of this hypothesis grew and was emboldened decade after decade after decade of Engel crawling over the political corpse of one mangled and vanquished foe after the next, ultimately raising the belt into the sky screaming, "Adrian!" That's a Rocky reference, I'm telling my age. And yet, after 30 years, Engel's indomitability was put to the test and found wanting. He wasn't a force of nature after all. A better experiment was created and revealed the truth. He was just a man. And with a better challenger, even the backing of Pelosi, Adam Schiff, and the whisperer king of blacks, whisperer to the king of blacks, Joe Biden, James Clapper, none of it mattered. Jamal Bowman didn't just win, he destroyed. I've thought a lot about the protests, especially in lieu of conversations I've been having on the show and on my own show, and I really do think something is being missed. In Kentucky, a close Senate race is occurring between liberal darling Amy McGrath, the expected favorite of this contest, versus Charles Booker, a state representative that came out of nowhere. Booker is currently leading the contest and could potentially win this contest. Now, you must understand how profound this is. McGrath had every advantage in this contest, including being a fundraising powerhouse, the backing of the Democratic Party itself being chosen basically by the Democratic Party. I've told you before, 90% of the races are won by the side with the most cash. Which means that if Booker wins this, in and of itself, just by virtue of that alone, it would make this special in regards to a magnificent win. But dig deeper for the moment. Booker, African-American in lily white Kentucky, ran on a progressive platform of Medicare for all, Green New Deal, massive investment in left-behind communities, which are a lot in Kentucky, black, white, gay, straight, everything in between. And more importantly and more interesting, a strong emphasis on confronting criminal justice inequalities. He was in the streets with the other protesters as they were being tear gassed and pepper sprayed in response to the savage murder of Breonna Taylor, who was riddled with bullets by cops as she slept in her own home. He has a stirring video confronting the state where he's arguing how laws and the way that they're used in practice can and do kill. Black, white, gay, straight, everything in between. Cops kill 1,000 people a year. We only make up 13% of this country. Who do you think they're killing most? When the speaker cuts him off, he screams into the mic, "My life matters!" It is gut-wrenching and stirring to watch. Booker was a nobody in this race until the protests. Again, Kentucky is 85% white, more than 85% white, with blacks only making up 8% of the population. The people protesting with him, in many respects, were predominantly white. For him to be competitive in this race, he has to get a predominance of white support. And he's doing so on social, racial, and economic justice, something that would have been unheard of just a month or two ago. The New York Times posts or notes, Monmouth University poll found that 76% of Americans consider racism and discrimination a big problem, up 26 points from 2015. The poll also found that 57% of voters thought the anger behind the demonstrations was fully justified, while a further 21% called it somewhat justified. Polls show that a majority of Americans believe that the police are more likely to use deadly force against African Americans, and that there's a lot of discrimination against Black Americans in society. Back in 2013, when Black Lives Matter began, a majority of voters disagreed with all of these statements. What is the point of a movement if not to shift the perspective of a nation, right? What's interesting in the shift of the perspective is that it's not so much regarding the call to defund the police, Black Lives Matter main call. That suffers in the polling. What I strongly suspect is that Black Lives Matter is a stand-in for blacks as a whole, with the public coming to grips with inequities, social, racial, economic, that all at once it's realizing needs to be in some way resolved. This is separate and distinct from the unpopular call to defund the police. This gets to the heart and to the core of America itself. While the protests may seem chaotic, or for that matter, that it lacks a cohesive message, I would say that the response of your public, including in these races, and the success of lefties in these races show that the language was used and internalized by the public. This also, by the way, includes a 26-point jump into Black Lives Matter. You must understand what that means. Despite the polling, or despite the protests maybe not being cohesive, despite it being chaotic at some points, despite things being set on fire at other points, and that it being chaotic, that people are asking, what do you want? What's the message? Defund the police doesn't seem all that popular. Despite all of that, the public gets it. Sublime, profoundly gets it. And again, what is the point of a movement if not to get that effect? This is why I support the protests. If anything is to get accomplished, you have to start somewhere. And right now, our political system is entirely inattentive to the wants of the public. Again, blacks are dying 3-1, and the party that gets 90-something% of black support doesn't care. It doesn't have anything in real terms to deal with that issue. The poverty and inequities of those particular communities, again, nothing to deal with those things. And while an argument can be made that pulling down the statute doesn't necessarily get to the root of the matter, or for that matter, protesting X or protesting Y in and of itself doesn't necessarily get to the root of the matter, I would disagree. I would say before you get anything accomplished in a political space, or for that matter, even from a larger societal point of view, you have to start with the workable point of view of your public. How do you get civil rights legislation without the workable point of view of your public changing? How do you get this workers' rights legislation without the workable point of view of your public changing? Women's rights, gay rights, whatever you want to think of from the standpoint of any particular movement, of any particular protest, of any particular group of people that have gone out in order to push for their rights, their civil liberties. It starts with the workable point of view of the public changing. And I can look at the polling and show that this shift is significant, is profound, and potentially may be long-lasting. A public, for once, is reconciling the inequities in social, economic, and criminal justice. And within a very short span of time, it's trying to grapple with those things. It's inelegant, but it is there. This is why I support the protests. If anything is going to get accomplished, you got to start somewhere. Shane, you may disagree with me on this, actually, but I think the polling speaks for itself. There's been a shift, and that shift has resulted in Booker being the lead of that race right now. And you can even make somewhat of an argument that Engel, all of the mistakes that he made and everything else is fair enough, but you can make a case that Engel's race also was influenced. I mean, lefties across the board were winning en masse. And I don't mean Democratic Party. I mean lefties. I mean people with a very strong bend towards this notion of social, criminal justice, economic justice, and those type of things. These people were ascendant on Tuesday's primary. So what do you think about that? Do you think that there's a legitimacy to that in the sense of, yes, there may not be a cohesive message in the terms of policy in the way that you would want this kind of just intellectual discussion. True. But however they're expressing themselves, the public gets it.
Here's my take. I'm going to quote from, I actually don't know what his standing is in the left-wing community at this point, but he used to be known as a leftist. I'm going to quote Noam Chomsky here for a second. Propaganda is to a democracy what the bludgeon is to a totalitarian state, end quote.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And I think here's why I'm like, while I believe in the core motivation behind the protests, while I recognize, I'll just put it like this, while I recognize that core motivation, and I believe that motivation needs to be expressed in action, in specifically substantive changes to our government, to the future of our society, and to our society itself, to our culture. What I see here is the establishment, all of the powers that be, as far as I can tell, voicing these same concerns. And when I see this happening right before an election, when I see all that's really happened so far as I can tell, some statues have been taken down, these bills are being put into Congress, some local changes have been made, but no changes so far have been made that would, actually end the problems that people are complaining about, that would even take some substantial steps toward ending those problems. And so what I'm worried about is that this is propaganda, that not the movement itself necessarily, but that the way that the movement is being actuated, the way that the movement is being processed by our political system has turned into this long slow, fiery propaganda machine. That's what I'm concerned about. We'll come back to that. A lot of stuff to talk about there. We're going to be taking calls this next segment, 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. If you want to call in. Should be an interesting conversation. We'll be coming back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we are back. I'm Shane Stranahan, joined by my co-host Jamarl Thomas. We're taking calls this segment. You can call in at 202-521-1320. Also, a quick note, if you want to listen to us and you're not listening to us currently, you can hear us on the radio in Washington, D.C. on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM if you're in Kansas City. You can also listen to us 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Quick note also, if you want to listen to us on the computer, your desktop, phone, tablet, whatnot, we're on YouTube, Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you can find the truly best podcast, and in our case, radio shows. Anyway, so again, we're taking calls this segment. We were just having an interesting conversation, or at least I'd sort of responded in a big way. Jamarl, you want to come back with that?
I do want to come back with that. I think it's an interesting conversation. I do. I think I massively disagree with you on this one. I think the reason is because in every movement, you always have somebody trying to co-opt. That in and of itself doesn't legitimize the movement. The catch here is, what are they trying to push for? And I think it's unreasonable to expect change overnight. I just do. I don't think no situation happens where within 2 months, all of a sudden the political device all immediately changes, especially when the federal government, for the most part, doesn't care. I mean, it's gotten a perspective over the course of the last, 40 years, that basically it doesn't care what the public wants. So it takes somewhat of a sustained effort against that. But that's not something that delegitimizes what they are in the sense that they haven't got changed. They have gotten changed on the local levels. I agree with you that the political device, Democrats, are going to try to drop this like a hot potato the moment they get in office. Totally agree. I also agree with you that, but I think the issue is this. There's no propensity to deal with them. Like, there's no propensity, there's nothing in the sense of what Democrats are willing to accept, or for that matter, Republicans are willing to accept, that will actually deal with the issues that they are putting up in any real tangible ways. I've argued before that the Democratic Party was going to focus on cops, and they were going to entirely blame cops for an issue that is not entirely the cops' fault. What I mean by that is, if your political system decides we are going to just throw cops in to poverty and have those cops deal with that, well, that's a horrendous outcome. Because you could deal with the poverty in and of itself where you could just basically whittle away the need for those cops. But we don't do that. And we push cops in a position or situation to which they have no power to deal with. They're working at the end of a process, not at the beginning of that process. And they can only, at the end of the day, lock people up. We have 25% of people in our prisons around the world. That's obscene. We only have 5% of the population. So I hear you, but I think it's unreasonable to believe that within 2 months, the public or your federal government that has gotten just basically a tin ear for decades is going to automatically change. I do think it takes a sustained action. I do agree with you that they will try to be co-opted, but whether they're trying or not is irrelevant to what they're trying to accomplish and whether or not as a sustained effort over time they'll be able to do it, especially after the evictions take place and all of these people go bust all at once in July. The tint of this is going to change. I believe it's going to get to broader concerns, and it will be a sustained siege warfare on our entire political and economic system in trying to get changes. But that's not a foregone conclusion of a success. So
I agree with that. I totally agree with that. I'll put it like this. I'll start from a first principle here. we're talking about the motivation. The motivation, in some sense, is the ultimate reason for the movement. It just literally, you can think of it physically. You have this potential momentum. You have this motivation. You have this desire to make change in society. And until that desire gets activated, and in this case, it turned into this movement, it's moot. You know what I mean? You need to do something with that motivation. Now, my problem
That's
is
not
with
true.
Well, go
I mean,
ahead.
the calling it moot. I'm sorry. I'm just saying that's not true. I mean, saying that the motivation is moot until
change happens. Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. If you can be stuck in your motivation for an entire life, that's the thing. People have, again, I'm taking it philosophical or psychological for a second, but somebody can have a motivation, but if they don't act on that motivation, they're just going to get weaker and weaker and weaker as they get older. If you have a motivation and there's not some process to make that motivation happen, to turn that motivation into action, then you're just living in a dream. And I'm tired of Americans just living in a dream. And that includes, sadly, every aspect of American society, including the elites. My take on this thing, like you're saying, the rent crisis is going to be coming up this next month. At the same time, by all appearances, we're going to be hitting a huge phase in this pandemic. A lot of people dying. And with the decisions coming out in the last day regarding Obamacare, regarding the ACA, whatever you think about it, a lot of people are probably going to be out of healthcare. Now, that's going to massively amplify the size of the movement. Now, there are two things about that, in my opinion, one good, one bad. The bad thing, I'll start with that, is I don't see that movement, the resulting movement, getting any clearer. If anything, it's going to get less clear as more and more people are brought into the tent, as people's emotions get more and more agitated, as the system breaks down. Like the upside of this is that I really think that in some ways we need to push the system to a point, maybe not to the breaking point, but we need to push the system, because for years and years and years, whether you're on the left or the right, a lot of people in this country have had totally legitimate grievances that have not been expressed or recognized by the political system. So in this abstract sense, I think it's going to be a good thing, just almost thermodynamically or mechanically. You know what I mean? There needs to be a change, and we should push for that change. But with this movement, what I want to see is again the stuff that I think you were saying we should be getting to. It might take time. You might be right about that. We'll see. That's my take, though.
So there are a few points. Motivation in and of itself is primary. It always starts there. If you don't have motivation, nothing happens. Meaning the very act of having a motivation is not living in a dream world. There are all sorts of situations where you could be a slave, for example. You could be living in apartheid South Africa. You can have all sorts of motivation in the world to change that situation without the ability to do so because the events don't present themselves to do so. Think of Tsarist Russia. In Tsarist Russia, you had a lot of pain, injury with the Tsar that was basically fabulously wealthy and the population that was basically dirt poor. That motivation was there. It took a war in order to act that motivation because they needed an opportunity to actually make that active. I would say that what are millions of people in the streets if not an activation of motivation? I don't understand what you mean by that. Basically, I don't think it's a moot point where you have millions of people in the streets all across the world. And more importantly, you have to explain how the point of view of all of these people change in this country in a fundamental way if that is not activation of that motivation.
Here's what I said. Maybe I phrased things unclearly, but what I said was motivation is moot until it turns into action, until it turns into momentum, until it turns into a movement. I'm not saying that this movement is moot. I'm saying anyway, we have two callers. Let's get to the callers here. Let's go first.
Fault lines.
Actually, yeah, three callers. Carrie from Louisiana. Let's go to Carrie from Louisiana. What's on your mind?
Hey, Shane. Hey, Jamal. Thanks for taking the call. Real quick, concerning the Bowman primary victory over Engel. Fantastically excited about it. If for no other reason that Eliot Engel has for decades now been the stalwart Zionist representative of the Democratic Party. So hopefully that can abate to some extent. On the other hand, it's predictable, I suppose, that when we elevate these progressives, that eventually, often sooner than later, they'll disappoint us. And I'm disappointed in Bowman's already professed opposition to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. The same man who stands for tests that are going on here. I don't understand how he can. What's the difference? And I'll let you guys talk about that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's disappointing. I mean, it's like, look, Martin Luther King, when he gave that speech against the Vietnam War, a lot of people don't know this, but he was roundly attacked even by blacks. Like, what are you need to dig with these Negro issues. Why are you talking about those people in Vietnam? But Martin Luther King's point was the same boot that is on the throat of blacks in this country is the same boot that works abroad. And it is impossible to get anything done from standpoint of economic development here if you're spending all of your resources and attention there. He has a good point with that, I think. So yeah, I agree with you, man. Shane?
Yeah, I agree too. I mean, it's interesting. Yeah. I need to look into it more. Let's go to Louise from Virginia.
Yeah.
Yes, good morning. And you and Jamal are too good to interrupt. I'm just calling to make sure that you know about the representative, I think she is, in Oakland, California, whose first name is Barbara, I can't remember the last name, who has come out publicly calling to defund the military budget by some $29 billion or some such. I just can't remember her last name, but you would know it. Okay, and you're both doing a stupendous
Barbara
job.
Lee?
Thanks.
Wait, is it Barbara Lee? It's probably Barbara Lee. Barbara Lee is astonishing as a congressman. Do you know immediately after the Iraq War, where all of this hysteria was going into this notion of we were attacked, we need to hit the people that attacked us, and Barbara Lee was like, yeah, this is a horrible idea. I can't support this because this is going to come back to bite us and haunt us later. Barbara Lee was absolutely right. And she had
She was the only member of Congress.
Only member. Like, that's astonishing, right? I mean, that takes all sorts of courage for her to do that. So it may be Barbara Lee who we're talking about.
That is astonishing. Yeah, we've got Ingrid. Ingrid from DC. You're on the air. What's on your mind, Ingrid? Ingrid. Oh, we may be having, you know what? Ingrid had audio problems with us the last time. If you remember, she had to call in a couple of times, and it wasn't until like 9:15, our last taking call segment, that we were able to get her. I hope we don't have an encore of that last thing, but we'll see. Just want to highlight, Ingrid is a friend of the show, frequent caller, been calling for a long time now. Hopefully we can get on.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No, man, it's weird and interesting times. It really is, and maybe that's where my excitement is. Usually when we get up the very next day, we always know what's going to be the same. You know what I mean? Like, it's like the same thing that happened today is basically the same thing that happened tomorrow. This was part of the reason why I used to say travel makes me a better person, because I don't know what's happening the next day. And it enlivens your senses. It makes you have to focus on life and be kind of in the moment and dealing with that stuff. Whereas here, you end up in autopilot. There's something deadening about that. And I think the protests changes that.
It's true. I'm gonna put it like this.
Think of it. Yeah.
I think we're entering a singularity. I think, and no, I don't mean like the technological singularity, just the singularity in the sense of a point beyond which you can't anticipate what's going to happen. We're entering a phase of complete unknowns, and it's really exciting and it's really frightening, and it's both of those things at the same time. It is a crisis, and it's not just a national crisis. With the pandemic, of course, it's a worldwide crisis, but also with the U.S., with its military, if that starts to fade, if that system starts to topple, that becomes a worldwide seismic shift. Not to make too many puns based on the name of our show, but it would be a huge change. And so I was thinking about this last night. You know, sometimes you think thoughts, other times you think other thoughts, and then you kind of forget in each set of thoughts what you're thinking in the other.
Right. Exactly. right.
And then that often comes with alternating between different like emotional modes. You know, you feel different ways about the things you're thinking. And so last night this was kind of happening. Right. At some points I would be like, wow, this is heavy. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm kind of afraid. And other points I'm like, this is really exciting. Let's make something happen.
It's exciting.
This is a huge opportunity. That's the thing. And I think the second one is definitely more empowering, but I think we need to keep all that stuff in context too. What's your take?
No, I agree with you, man. I find it to be exciting. When Sanders flamed out, something in me died. This turns it back on. But let's wrap. This is Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan. We have an amazing guest coming up in the next segment, Stephen Lindman. We will be back in a moment. Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear, 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamal Thomas, here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. We're coming to you from the capital of the nation, Washington, D.C. If you're in the area, you can listen to us at 105.5 FM. You can also catch us in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you are digging what we're putting down, be sure to give us a like and share this content, whichever platform you're viewing us on. Also, you can get involved in the conversation by sending a chat, a tweet, or for that matter, giving us a call at 202-521-1320. So we've had several great discussions yesterday with various guests from different backgrounds giving their perspective on the protests erupting across the country, virtues and excesses. Our next guest will provide what I consider to be a prodigious degree of context on how the people in the streets pushing for change have been economically aggrieved and the path for constructively changing it. We're joined by geopolitical analyst and author of How Wall Street Fleeces America, Privatized Banking, Government Collusion, and Class War, Stephen Lindeman. Stephen, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Oh, Jamal, Shane, good to be on. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for joining us, Stephen.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get into a full-blown discussion, and this will probably lead into a full-blown discussion either way, I'd like to start off with the obvious question, especially with a title like that in the book. Through what lens are you viewing this protest? And through that lens, do you see a potential for it that is systemic over time, meaning something fundamentally changes? Or for that matter, what are the potential vagaries of this protest if it takes an unproductive path?
There isn't any doubt whatsoever that protesting against the system that does so much harm to so many people benefit the privileged few at the expense of almost everybody else. Certainly it's justified and it needs to continue. Whether it'll bring any results or not, well, it'll be a good long while to tell whether anything meaningful happens. If past is prologue, a phrase I like to use often, the odds are greatly against people wanting constructive change, wanting government that serves everybody in the country equitably. It's never been this way in the U.S. before. And there have been protests, there have been protests throughout the years. I mean, I'm old enough to remember what went on in the 1960s, the civil rights protests, the anti-war protests. There were benefits that were gained, but the energy behind them waned, and all the benefits were lost. The anti-protests, U.S. wars never stopped. They just slowed down a little bit and basically changed from direct U.S. wars to proxy wars in Central America and elsewhere and so on. Things that, and then it cranked up again at the end of the 1980s, getting back into gear. The first one, there was one in the 1980s. The U.S. invaded Grenada, of all places, in the hemisphere, Grenada, to protect U.S. medical students. Well, they weren't threatened by anybody, but they wanted to get rid of a government that was to the left of center, and that's exactly what the invasion was all about. And then Panama came after that, killed God knows how many tens of thousands of people to get rid of a U.S. ally who forgot who was boss, so they got rid of him. And it went on and on for over the last 3 decades. So wars go on endlessly, more outrageously today than ever before, throughout the World War era. And the same thing about the civil rights movement. All of the gains of the 1960s were lost. And then along came Occupy Wall Street a number of years ago. It looked like that might have some legs, but they were infiltrated by dark forces, which is what's going on right now against the protests, the Black Lives Matter protest. I'm very dubious about the leadership of Black Lives Matter, even though there's no question in my mind that rank and file people are legitimate and they have legitimate grievances and they deserve redress for the stuff that's going on that's harming them. But you get people that are bought off, and I saw mention of the fact that the Black Lives leadership, if I'm getting this right, more or less explaining it that way, got. It's hard for me to believe this, but I'll say it anyway. Got a $100 million grant from the Ford Foundation. $100 million grant. Good Lord. $1 million would have been a lot. $100 million? Well, corporate America doesn't. Anybody wants something back in much greater amounts in return. So I'm dubious about Black Lives Matter leadership. But again, I am with the people on the streets, and I absolutely support them. And it's not a black issue. It's a universal issue for ordinary people in America. People of color are mostly harmed, but it's people of ordinary people of all classes in the U.S. that are harmed by the nation's powerful interests. They're the ones benefiting, and they do it by exploiting other people. And the major banks in the U.S. are the main culprits.
That's interesting. I need to look into the $100 million thing. I see it reported on some of the right-wing sites, but I need to look into it a little bit further. But that's interesting if that's true. To make your point though, that they have been aggrieved, and that you may have the people who are on the streets, whatever going on at the top echelon in regards to Black Lives Matter. You still have the people who are in the streets who are doing so for legitimate reasons. And especially when you're talking about the number of people who are going to be either kicked out of their houses, and what is going to happen in July is going to be profound and something like we've never seen before in this country, with the number of people who are thrown out of their houses or just go bust all at once. So from your standpoint, what is, in basic terms, the system is corrupt. Can you explain basically how these systems, economic, judicial, political, have joined together to basically screw over the American population?
The U.S. is run by powerful interests, and they're headquartered in corporate boardrooms. These corporations are just gargantuan in size. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when they were big corporations in America, but they were practically caught up mom and pop operations 70, 80 years ago compared to what they are today. I mean, they're behemoths, and they're international. I mean, they operate in countless numbers of countries around the world. They may not operate with as much power in certain ones as they want to, but they certainly dominate the West. They dominate most other countries. They want to get greater dominance in countries that the U.S. doesn't control: China, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, these countries. But they're extremely powerful. The U.S. political system is money controlled. You don't get elected in the U.S. to high office. Maybe you do at a local level, especially in a small city, but in larger cities and at the state level, at the federal level, you don't get elected to office unless you get big money behind you. And there are occasional exceptions to the rule, but they're very rare exceptions, and they don't have lasting power. Somebody may get elected and be in Congress for a number of years, and then big money goes up against that person, and they rout them out of office by getting somebody else in. So whatever moneyed interest in the country wants, led by the major banks on Wall Street, is what they get, because they put the people in power to serve their interests, and this is the way the country is run. They get served exploiting everybody else, not just in the U.S., but worldwide. It's a terrible situation where enormous harm is done by the great majority by a tiny minority of people against great majority of people in the U.S. and most everywhere else, and the benefits that people are getting right now, unemployment and so on, they run out in about 4 weeks or so at the end of July. There's nothing going on in Washington to extend them, and the point you made is absolutely accurate. If these benefits aren't extended, most of these jobs, millions of them, are not coming back. They're certainly not coming back anytime soon. What will these people do? They won't have their food stamps will run out. They won't have the income. They'll be thrown in the street because they can't pay rent or service mortgages. Will the country let them starve to death? Will there be more people on the streets that have rooftops over their heads? What on earth will happen? There has never been anything going on in the U.S. remotely close to what's happening today. There is a depression going on. It didn't begin 6 months ago. It began at least in 2008, and I've written about this through the years. For the last dozen years, there has been a depression going on in the U.S. with people, even the ones that have jobs, they have rotten jobs. They need 2 or 3 of them to survive. Households, many of them having a husband and a wife, 2 people working. They've got to do that because most of the jobs that are created in the U.S. pay poverty wages. You can't live on that. If you make $7.50 an hour, how can anybody possibly survive on an income like that? They cannot. And then, so now millions at over 40. What's the number now? 47. Yesterday, another 1.5 million filed for unemployment benefits. I think the number is something like 47.5 million people have applied for unemployment benefits. To call it close to 50 million people, and the number is an unaccount. So it really is over 50 million people, workers in America that have no jobs. If their benefits run out in 4 or 5 weeks, again, what on earth will they do?
I think you're right. I think that that is exactly the right lens to look at the future through right now. It's interesting, too. I'll put this in. We've had Tom Luongo on earlier this week on Monday. Tom Luongo, libertarian economist. When he was on, he said something that surprised Jamarl and I quite a bit, which is he was in favor of another stimulus package. He was saying that would be the politically expedient move right now. And it was kind of shocking to us, but I think that he was right. And it's the fact that it was surprising is interesting because I think that, again, it's counterintuitive, but here's the thing. A lot of people need that. Like you're saying, it's becoming existential. It's getting to that critical crisis point. Now, I actually, there are a couple of directions I was thinking of going. It's great to have you on, by the way. I think we've only spoken by phone off the show. This is the first time we've ever talked on the show, so it's great to have you. But here's where I'll go with this. We're talking, the title for this segment, what we brought you on to talk about originally was this book you wrote back in 2011, How Wall Street Fleeces America, Privatized Banking, Government Collusion, and Class War. And these were all, that book, the ideas that you're talking about, the history that you're describing in that book is one of the foundations, I think, that set us up for the types of crises that we're going through right now, both economically and in a weird way socially. I don't need to get into that right now. But regardless, in the blurb, in the description of your book, the first thing that you focus on is in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act, the creation of the Federal Reserve. And it's just maybe as a sort of reminder or a recapitulation, it would be good to do a light retread of the last century, just a brief overview of what's happened. In 1913, you had the Federal Reserve Act. About 16 years later, you had the Great Depression that lasted for about 10 years, during which you had this huge welling up of different ideologies. You had fascism, you had socialism. This was, again, one of these critical periods, a pivotal period in human history. Then, obviously, since then, you've had the Cold War. There was a sort of long-delayed crisis. You had various economic problems during the 70s, the 80s. Don't need to get too deep into those. But regardless, this sort of has led up to the housing crisis, this most recent Great Recession in 2007, 2008. And it seems like, I don't know, my impression at this point is that it's a little bit like a case we're on our last legs. We've sort of run out of our fuel. That might be critical. But regardless, would you be willing to just go over that history again? I just, again, very briefly laid out sort of key events there. But since you wrote the book, I thought maybe it'd be good to hear your perspective on this stuff.
History is very important, and I'd like to go back before 1913. You've got to go back to colonial America, where for roughly a generation, the colonies broke free from the control of moneyed interests in England, and they ran the U.S. their own way. Money in public hands, not private hands. And for that generation, the U.S. had about 25 years of prosperity. There were no recessions. There was virtually no inflation. The privileged people in the country mostly benefited because that's the way the nation has always been run, ordinary people not really getting the benefits. But there was economic stability throughout that entire period. The worst thing that a country can do is to give the power of money to private interests over public interests. And in the U.S. case, it violates the Constitution. The Constitution refers to coining, to U.S. coins. Well, it didn't refer to currency the way it is today, but my interpretation is, well, you can call them coins, you can give them any name that you want to give them. It's the U.S. money. The money should be controlled by the nation for the benefit of all the people of the nation, not for powerful business interests, for their own self-interest. And this is what happened by turning over the money. In 1913, the powers that be in the country convinced Congress to pass the Federal Reserve Act, and at the same time, forget if it was on the same day, but it was at the same time, they passed the U.S. Income Tax Act. U.S. income tax was passed to be able to pay bankers interest on the U.S. nation's money. At the time, they wouldn't.
All right, Stephen Lenman, it was my fatal error for asking that question right before we were supposed to go to a break, but I got you primed, I think. We're going to come back in just a minute. You can continue with that train of thought. You set us up, Federal Reserve Act, the founding of the income tax in America. Great, I think, great place to come back to. But regardless, we'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
And we are back. We're joined now by Stephen Lenman. He is an author and geopolitical analyst. We're specifically talking about a book he wrote almost a decade ago, How Wall Street Fleeces America, Privatized Banking, Government Collusion, and Class War. Now, Stephen, we have a caller, so I want to get to the caller in a minute or two, but I had set you up to go over the history of the American economy. Again, not something you should do in 5 minutes, let alone one. Regardless, though, could you keep on in that vein for a minute? Could you go through that retread with us, and then we can get to the caller who has a question for you?
Indeed, those two pieces of legislation, just terrible legislation, the Federal Reserve Act and the Income Tax Act, so the government could pay bankers, Wall Street bankers, interest on the nation's money that was handed to bankers to give them supreme control over the nation's money, which is the supreme power greater than all others. Controlling money, you control everything. Henry Kissinger said, control food and you control people, control oil and you control nations. And in my words, control money and you control everything else. You literally control everything else. I mean, there'd be no wars if I control the nation's money supply. There'd be no wars. There'd be none of the stuff going on that's inflicting enormous harm to the vast majority of Americans and vast majority of people everywhere else. The whole system would change. But with bankers controlling the power of money, they can do anything they want. They can steer the nation's economy and political system in any direction they want, domestically, geopolitically, anywhere else. And this is the dirty system. It's too debauched to fix. There's no way you can fix this unless you rip it down and rebuild it from the ground up with something entirely different. It would take a revolution to do that, which is really what we need to change the system. I don't believe in violence, and I would never advocate a violent revolution because all that will get you is more violence. But I do believe in a nonviolent revolution with staying power to really change the system. And if we don't change it, we may end up demise. We all may go the way up. Well, the U.S. one day will go the way of past empires in the dustbin of history. But with the power of thermonukes that exists today, that didn't exist way back when, the U.S. could take humanity along with it when it goes. It's a very, very dangerous situation.
We have a caller that wants to ask you a question. Henry, what's going on?
Yes, hi. Thanks. I want to ask my question first and then support it. for the guest, I wanted to ask, I hear you what you're saying about this possible deterioration or decline. Economically, I think maybe a solution can be, and I got this from a guy, Marcus Michael, he's running for president as a write-in. What do you think about if every single country, nation around the planet gave their citizens $7 million while keeping prices the same? And that's my question to you. And I just want to support it by saying that I agree 100%. I worked at a financial advisory company, a big one, really big, in 2008. And I also came to the same conclusion after, writing. I'm an economist. I did all the numbers, did all the graphs. And I know that you're more experienced, but I did my own analysis and came to the conclusion that basically the conclusion was that if the economy declined further at the 2008 period, then there was we would be done because of interest rates. I mean, so basically I'm just saying, and then I just wanted to, so I agree with you there. And then I want to also agree with what you're saying about, I wanted to also just mention when we colonized, when we came to colonize, where did everybody get their bullets? We fought these civil wars and these revolutionary wars. I mean, and when you think about it, where do we get our printing presses, if not from overseas? And then, so when we think about it, when we talk about United States of America, we're talking about America, we're talking about Canada, North America, and also South America, divided into England, France, and Spain for the most part. So, I mean, just something to think about. I forgot where I was going, but what about the $7 million, sir, for everybody? I mean, like if every country gave their citizens the exact same amount of money, to stimulate this thing, would that be the only solution aside from some type of debauchery?
Oh, thank you for the call, Henry. I really appreciate it. Just one point, and I'm going to let you answer, Stephen. I think inflation would be an issue. I mean, like if people, if you gave everyone $7 million and everyone, say, started to buy X or started to buy Y, you would get shortages. Those shortages would breed a certain degree of inflation. One last point. You're right about the overseas stuff. France was a big help in the United States during the revolution. But also, if you think of the Russian Revolution, Lenin was basically pushed and funded by Germany, who wanted to destabilize the Russian government to get them out of the war. So yeah, the caller has a point on that point. Stephen, what do you think about the $7 million grant to every citizen?
I can't speak to that specific amount, but I can remember writing articles that if the nation dropped money on Main Street instead of Wall Street, it could create prosperity and full employment in the country. The only time in my lifetime the U.S. had full employment was during World War II, when the men were away fighting the war and the women for the first time entered the workforce in force. But we should, the way to stimulate the economy. During the colonial period, we had 25 years of inflation-free prosperity, no recessions. So the way to repeat that now, if money power was returned to public hands, you took it away from private hands, the big Wall Street banks, the way it is now, and it's right in their documents that they control the nation's money supply. If you return it to public hands, we could have eternal prosperity with no recessions, no inflation, and then it would depend on the kind of government we had, whether the prosperity would be shared at least to some degree equally with ordinary people. It might not turn out that way, but it would be better. Now everybody would be employed, and if they earned a living wage, the way things were in the country many years ago, I mean, $7.50 an hour, I mean, you'll starve to death if you earn that kind of money. Even $15 an hour, you'd starve to death. I don't know how you pay your rent with an income like that. But the U.S. could literally be a different place if money power was in public hands the way it should be, instead of private hands. And I wrote a follow-up book to the Wall Street book. There were two Wall Street books. The first one was How Wall Street Fleeces America, and the second one was A Bank of Occupation, Waging Financial War on Humanity. And the two books are really a match set. I list them on the bottom of every article I write, if anybody is interested in wanting to get them. But America could be a completely different place if it was run right. But the policy.
Yeah. I mean, it really could.
interest.
I mean, even if it was something basic as Medicare for all, expansion of Social Security, wealth tax, those things would dramatically make America somewhat of a different place. And to your point, 30% of the people didn't pay their rent this month. And that number is only going to get worse. My mom, we lived making around $18,000 a year. And there was no window of latitude in regards to the stakes. Anything that happened was a catastrophe. If there was a speeding ticket, there was no way to pay that speeding ticket. If your kid needed to go on a field trip, there was no way to pay for that, even if it was like $50. Like we turned a blind eye to this. But 43% of the population, or 42% before the crash, before all of this stuff happened with COVID-19, was making $18,000 a year or less. And to your point, that's an astonishing number. How do people change that, though? Like the people who are in the streets protesting, say for the moment, I couldn't find anything corroborating the Black Lives Matter stuff on any kind of the $100 million thing on, let's say like I don't want to say mainstream, but there were people contesting that is true. It was being called a rumor. So I had to investigate that more. But I would say this. What is the pathway to this? Assuming for the moment that the top echelon of BLM is corrupted in some way. Well, you still have the large number of people who are protesting in the streets that are looking for very specific things and what they want. What is a constructive way for them to get those things? And what should they be going after as like a laser focus? Should they be going after if they indeed want to make constructive changes from the standpoint of social, racial, and economic justice in regards to the country?
For absolute certainty, the one way nothing constructive will be accomplished is through the ballot box, because the U.S. electoral system is rigged to perpetuate continuity the way things are now. The only way to get positive change is nonviolent activism in the streets and staying there. It took a decade in the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s to end war in Southeast Asia, a decade, and there were tremendous protests. There was mass activism, anti-war activism, and there were some decent people in Congress at that time. I mean, there's practically, there may be a few there now, but the vast majority in Congress today are hardliners, Dems. I never call them Democrats because there are no Democrats. At least the majority of people in the party are not Democrats, so I call them Dems or undemocratic Dems. But the hardliners dominate both wings, both right wings of the U.S. one-party state, which it really is. They're on the same page on all the major issues. And the only way to change the system is to get out on the streets and stay there nonviolently with good leadership to keep pressing for what we need to do to have a country that's safe and fit to live in. And it never, never, never will be accomplished any other way. It's why I have not voted for decades, and I will never vote again, because it's a waste of time.
That is the voice of Stephen Lenman. Stephen Lenman has just joined us for the last half hour for a great conversation about economics, civil society, how you make genuine change, lasting political change in our corrupted political process. Stephen is an author and geopolitical analyst. You can find him on Twitter at ActivistWriter, and you can also read his work at his website, stephenlendman.org. Again, that's STEPHENLENDMAN.org. Okay, there you go. A little bit stumbly, but you should have gotten that. Regardless, really great to have you on, Stephen. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's always good to be on with you.
Hopefully we can get you back on soon. All right, yeah, so here, one quick comment on this. It's something I've been thinking about. I don't have an answer to it. It's just a thought. There's this, you have protesting, you have voting. And as far as I can tell, those have become the political expedients for making change. Those are the things that we lean on in order to make change in our society. I think that, I don't know how to get into this, because I don't know how we'd get back into this, because there's a reason we might have lost it. But there's this conversation about civil society, not in the sense of these NGOs, not in the sense of civil society groups, not in the sense of any sort of centralized top-down attempt by some existing set of organizations or institutions to try to, change culture in various ways, which is what civil society, these civil society groups, it's what a lot of people sort of use that term as a euphemism for. But again, getting back to this idea of like local support, building up local institutions, making things happen locally. I don't know. I feel like we've lost that art. I feel like Americans were unique. You have this sort of representational democracy, but before that, obviously that's been there since the founding. But in some primordial sense, underneath that or underlying that is this like basin of solidarity, at least on this local level, where, you work through problems in your community. You might not get along with the community next door. There might be religious differences. There might be cultural differences, ethnic differences, however you want to put it. But at least you have that local connection and that local commitment and productivity. I think we've lost that. And I think that's a damn shame. And I think that it's part of this process. Again, if we have voting should be a part of our system, protesting should be a part of our system. But I want to get back to those real civil society groups, like local initiatives, genuinely local initiatives. Regardless, though, realizing we need to wrap up now, we're going to go into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. 2 more hours coming up. Great show. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, watch the clock.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. We are the men on the wall, the muscular giants, fearlessly springboarding into the blackness of political fractures. In the left corner, you have the indefatigable, ever-vigilant political analyst with a salacious fetish for doing the news, Jamal Thomas.
In the independent corner, you have investigative analyst and political theorist Shane Stranahan.
Get ready for the show that is the antidote for propaganda. We're both anecdotal and fond of data. It is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get into some headlines. So, in the United States, we have 41,000 new COVID-19 cases and more than 2,500 deaths in the last day. We are now back up to the peaks we saw several months ago. Democrats have passed a huge policing reform bill in the House led by Congressional Black Caucus, which probably will fail in the Republican-led Senate. The Trump administration has asked the Supreme Court to overturn the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, with an 82-page document. The DOJ said that the act became invalid when the previous Republican-led Congress passed a law that would prohibit individuals from being fined for not having health care. Some 40 million Americans would lose their health care as a result. And this will probably be on top of the 30 million or so that don't have it now. Head of the CDC said COVID-19 cases may be 10 times higher than expected. Meanwhile, the CDC has expanded the list of underlying conditions that could be caused by someone at risk of illness from COVID-19, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and pregnancy. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled in favor of Trump that asylum seekers will have no right to a federal court. A huge drop in humanitarian funding has a UN agency warning that millions of children in Yemen could be pushed to starvation over the coronavirus pandemic. 2.4 million malnourished children currently in the world's worst humanitarian crisis. That is farcical. They were already pushed into famine, going back from the war that the United States was assisting Saudi Arabia in waging on that country that Obama greenlit, but that's a whole second story. Research carried out by Italy and Tunisia suggests the presence of microplastics in commonly eaten types of food, fruits and vegetables. Apples were the most, with apples, the fruit most affected, and carrots and the vegetable most affected. Interesting. 3 members of the Wilmington, Delaware Police Department, Corporal Jesse Moore and officers Kevin Piner and Brian Gilmore, were fired on Tuesday after a department audit exposed a disturbingly sad and hateful video of commentary between co-workers where they designated an African-American magistrate a Negro in addition to a gay slur. Nice to know they weren't just racist. At one point, Piner tells Moore at one point during the phone call that he feels a civil war is coming, that he's ready, saying he's going to buy a new assault rifle, and soon we're just going to go out and start slaughtering them inward. I can't wait. God, I can't wait. Moore apparently wasn't racist enough to go that far. Instead, responded he wouldn't do that. You're all caught up. That's the news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I still can't get the dung right. The bing! Still can't get that right. Shane, the COVID-19 thing is disturbing to me. My channel, scream to the hilt. Deal with the pandemic. The pandemic is a real world thing. And because the pandemic is a real world thing, your ideology, reality doesn't care about your ideology. So you running with this notion, we got to open up the economy, we got to open up the economy, we got to open up the economy, even if that means mass loss of life, is utterly and entirely disturbing and is not what a rational government would do if it was working in the interest of the population. That's something that needs to be dealt with and internalized. Your government is basically in a situation where hundreds of thousands of people died, 120,000, if not more at this point. That number is only expected to rise, dramatically so. Many of the other nations were able to basically get COVID-19 down. The United States, if you look at the trend line is going up. And the death total, as Fauci made a point, lags in regards to the number of cases for obvious logical reasons. Well, this is an act of policy. It's not an act of God. And it's utterly and entirely disturbing to me that this number of people are dying as a result of that, especially when you have this disproportionate skew regarding African Americans versus whites, or for that matter, even Hispanics versus whites. This is problematic. I wonder, do you think this would have larger political implications? I think the answer to that is yes. But do you think it's going to have larger political implications by the time we get to November? That's the catch. That's the question.
Yeah. This is, it all is. I mean, this is a huge crisis. Again, I don't know how the election in November is going to go down, but I bet it's going to be controversial as heck, because of everything that's going on, not just the rental crisis that you're anticipating that we're either next month or in July. We'll see what happens with that. We'll see what the stimulus bill, if there is one, comes and does. But the whole thing, I don't think that there's another election like this in my lifetime. I mean, the closest thing would have been between Bush and Obama, I guess, with the housing crisis and the whole recession thing. But this seems categorically different. It seems like on a whole nother level in multiple ways, and that includes the economy. Again, there's trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars during the first couple of weeks of the economic response to this crisis. I don't see how that's not going to come back to bite us. That's another conversation. But yeah, to just answer your question, totally, this is going to have huge political consequences.
Yeah, I think it will. I mean, when the polling that recently came out by the New York Times, I think Siena poll had like a 14-point lead by Joe Biden. Joe Biden is in his basement. Like, Joe Biden is not even running a race per se. He had a pillow fight of a primary. And on top of having a pillow fight of a primary, now, his own people, Terry McAuliffe, basically say, yeah, if Joe Biden doesn't talk to two people, we'll be good with that. Let's keep him in the basement. And so it's like Trump is so over the top bad that in a moment where you have a national crisis, like, to put it in perspective, when FDR dealt with the Great Depression, that's the speech where he said, where people say, you fear, you only have, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. That was that speech. That was when he came in office, his inauguration speech. And he was going after basically creating the New Deal in order to deal with the Great Depression. FDR was amazing. Like, you're talking about Social Security, you're talking about forcing or pushing unions, Glass-Steagall. These things were basically done in like the first 100 days or the period after, because he was serious about it. I got in office to do this. This is what I'm going to do. We don't have that. Like, there doesn't seem to be any notion of rational, logical action in regards to dealing with the material conditions of the public. And as such, death has ensued. And fortunately, the public, I do believe, will hold him responsible for it. The catch is, the person who they're putting in is Joe Biden, which he doesn't deserve it in the least, especially with the moment that we're having.
I'll put it like this. If you look, Roosevelt, FDR got in 1932. That's a couple of years into the Great Depression. He was a governor at the time, but that's, he got in after the Great Depression had started. I'm thinking it's going to be something similar. Joe Biden is not the leader who anybody needs or wants, and frankly, neither is Trump. Both of them, obviously, huge problems. They can't bring the country together, and that is the definition of leadership in some senses, bringing people together to solve a problem. So both of them just fail flat out, automatically, categorically. But I think that a thing, learning from what happened with FDR, learning how he started out as a governor, then he was elected as president. It's going to be something similar. I don't know who that leader is going to be. I think it's a good time to start looking, though. You know what I mean? It's a good time to start paying attention to who's putting forward proposals, who's sort of pushing back against the right areas. I think that's really, in some sense, the conversation a lot of people should be having this election. If we can do that before the election hits, fat chance, in my opinion, then maybe we can get a better person in the seat. But I don't see practically how that's going to happen. It's just idealism. But at least for the next election, 2 years from now, pardon me, the next presidential election 4 years from now, but also obviously congressional elections in the next couple of years, I think we're gonna want that. We're gonna want to be looking for that. So anyway, a bit rambly there, but that's my take.
No. I think that's a fair point. I mean, it's like you said, Joe Biden is not that person. But I guess my biggest fear is that Joe Biden gets in office without offering anything because he doesn't have to, because of how particularly bad Donald Trump is. And that, honestly, is a real shame for the nation. And we need to really reconcile why that is. Like when you get 60-something% of people who are saying, I'm just voting for Joe Biden in order to get Trump out of office, you need to reconcile with that. Understand the blue no matter who stuff, this notion of removing political accountability, making this argument that, well, you pick the D even if it's a ham sandwich. I would tell you this, a ham sandwich would be further ahead of Donald Trump right now. That's how bad Joe Biden is in regards to him as a candidate. But we need to reconcile that. Why is that the case? Why do you end up with the Joe Biden this time around where you have all of these people who are clamoring for something else going on? Meaning you have an entire public that is clamoring for all of these policies, agreed with them across the board. Nevertheless, you have the Democratic Party saying no. And the people saying you still got to vote Democrat. Where is your accountability and where is your ability to hold these guys accountable? And why don't you have that ability to hold these guys accountable? And is that not something you need to reconcile? Because if you don't reconcile it, you keep ending up with people like Joe Biden that doesn't in any way represent the interests of the public. And yet we're at this seminal moment where the arc of history is begging to be begged and turned into a particular direction. Like if you think back with Clinton for the moment, where Clinton looked at lefties, Jesse Jackson, and told them you have nowhere else to go. And that's basically the honest assessment where they can turn to lefties. You have nowhere else to go. They'll turn to blacks. You have nowhere else to go. The monster's another party. The way blacks focus on politics is who keeps the monsters at bay. Well, under that model, whatever the Democrat is, you're basically stuck with. And I'm telling you this from personal experience. Blacks don't have two parties to vote for. There's only one. And so this notion of, I mean, technically, yes, there's more than one. But in real terms, as you're growing up, there's only one, which is why you get 91% of blacks voting for Hillary Clinton, despite the fact Hillary Clinton was, hot sauce in her pocket, was basically the biggest pander that she gave to blacks. I guess I'm saying we need to really reconcile this as a society, especially from the standpoint of the Democratic Party, where there needs to be a come to Jesus moment and asking, why is your political system organized in a way where you are just voting for somebody year after year after year, one election after the next, where it's entirely just to stop the other person? I think that's utterly and entirely disturbing. And like you said, it's hard to extricate ourselves from that. And speaking of that, by the way, Democrats have passed a huge policing reform bill in the House with the Congressional Black Caucus, which will probably fail in the Republican-led Senate. What do you think about their bill, by the way? Like, I'm interested. Like, yeah, go ahead. Republicans put out theirs, which basically didn't do much of anything, and Democrats put out theirs. What do you think about their bill?
I think the provisions in there about like increased oversight, that stuff's good, but I need to look into it more. And I'm kind of waiting because there is this Republican-led bill that seems to have failed. It's a back and forth. And so what I want to do, would be cool to do, is a comparison. You just look at what each one's putting forward that the other one doesn't like, and then we have a conversation about that. I want to respond real quick to some of the stuff you were saying about accountability, and then we have some callers I think we should get to. But by the way, we're going into a taking call segment. So real quick, we have two callers on the line right now. But if you want to call in, 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. My quick response, you're talking about accountability. I think this is the right thing to come back to. Another way of putting accountability from the person's perspective, the person in that position, is responsibility. But I think accountability is the right way to put it because it's a sort of social perspective on things. Can we hold this person to account? Now, in my opinion, what keeps there maybe two categories of things that keep people from being accountable. This is probably an oversimplification, but one would be, they're just completely removed from the situation, has nothing to do with them, or maybe they're involved, but they're not choosing to be held accountable. They're not putting themselves in a position where ultimately their decisions are going to matter, and therefore they've stepped back. Another, on the extreme opposite end of the spectrum, is when you have a monopoly. In other words, internationally, the United States has had a monopoly on violence for about 30 years, call it that. And that's, you can say that's not technically true, but I think you get my point. The United States internationally has been able to sort of act without dramatic repercussions, without at least immediate repercussions, for about 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. So that's one area. But if you look, again, we're talking about party politics. If you look in the United States, the two parties if you want to, consider them as two completely separate parties, which I think, they arguably are. But then there's this conversation about all of the corporate connections and backdoor ties and all that stuff. Regardless, these two parties have had a monopoly on politics in America, and that's why we can't hold them accountable. Just straightforwardly, they have a monopoly on these things. And I think we should trust bust them. I think that's the way to do it. It's just a matter of how. But regardless, we have two callers. We're going to go into a segment. Let's get back to those callers on the other side of the segment. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Tune in every Friday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for a weekly segment of the worst mainstream media headlines of the week. They tell us what's behind the worst, most misleading, and funniest headlines from around the news with Steve Patt of the blog Left Eye on the News. Together, they pull apart the corporate media's bias, spin, and downright lies. Tune in this Friday and every Friday for the worst and most misleading headlines of the week.
Fault Lines.
And we are back again. We're taking calls this segment. Our number is 202-521-1320. If you want to call again, that's 202-521-1320. Quick programming note. If you want to listen to us online, you can find us on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, YouTube, Stitcher, wherever you can find the truly best radio shows and podcasts. Or if you want to listen to us the old-fashioned way on the radio, we're on 105.5 FM and 1390 AM in Washington, D.C., and in Kansas City, we're on 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Regardless, though, we're taking calls this segment, 202-521-1320. And I want to go to Ingrid first. She tried to call in last hour. Let's see if we can get her on first. Ingrid, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I want to comment on the protests, but first off, yesterday you had Bill Ayers on, and a very interesting discussion. Part of it was about education and about tailoring education to individual students. It all sounded very idealistic. It sort of reminded me of Ivan Illich and retooling and deschooling society. But just as an observation, I think probably the Chinese have the exact opposite of that form of education, yet they seem to have been able to handle world events like this coronavirus much better than we have. So that's just an observation that, and I think there must be, regardless of what personal interests people have, there should be some kind of a universal basic education. But as far as the protests, really, Stephen Lenman said exactly what I would have said about this. I think it's pretty early. I haven't made my mind up. I don't know where these protests are going yet. I think he's quite right that there are counterproductive elements probably in leadership and definitely in certain factions that are taking the directions this way and the other. And as far as my interests, which is in peace around the world and foreign policy, I don't know if they're ever going to get around to that. They go off into this identity politics. Somehow New York became all transgender black rights. Well, the transgender people are trying to get equal rights so that they can join the military, so they can go abroad and kill people with equal rights to the rest of the army. So that doesn't really help me at all.
I think they might be. I think that I don't think that's all that they're pushing for, but I will take your point. Yeah. And I think I agree with you about the identity politics thing. I think that has, I don't know, on the one hand, you want to actually correct the injustices, but on the other hand, if that's all that the Democratic Party is sort of turned into, not saying that it is necessarily, but I think people can catch my drift there.
It has. No, I'll say it.
Yeah.
It has. I'll say it. I have no issue with saying it. Identity politics has destroyed black politics. Full stop. It has utterly broken it. It's nothing wrong with having this notion that we're going to defend various people's identity and meaning we're solidarity in ensuring that nobody has treated you in the sense of being racist or sexist or bigoted, all that stuff. I don't want anybody impinging your freedoms to be able to operate in this society in a fair, balanced way than anybody else. However, the Democratic Party has taken that and turned that into a way of ignoring economic realities. So they would put in a black face, a gay face, or whatever face, as in lieu of actually dealing with things that would materially benefit the situation. So they would say Joe Biden would credibly look at the situation with all of these people in the streets, and his response would be, all right, I need a black person as vice president. The ultimate of affirmative action in regards to putting somebody in that spot. Why? Because he recognizes that the population wants something. However, he wants to give a performative win where nothing is really gained in the process. That performative win will be putting Kamala Harris as VP. And so I agree with you that identity politics has completely ignored the economic realities. I mean, Obama was black. That his blackness didn't stop him from giving 95% of the income to the top 1%. Do you believe that money would have been best used with a person being white and having that money go into the bottom share of the population? Of course it would have been better off. So I agree with you, Ingrid. There's one point, the universal education. I also agree with you on this. And you, Shane, and I think we might disagree. I believe that there needs to be some level of collective union in the way that we organize. And I do believe public education is a way to do that. Public education has all sorts of failings. Don't misunderstand me. And one of those failings, I would argue, is not having a strong idea of government and civics to be built into the fabric of the education system itself. So when people get out of class, they still have this idea and this mindset of government that they need to interact in to ensure that they are holding these people accountable. I don't think you get that entirely with individuals who basically teach their kids whatever they individually want to teach their kids. Not to mention, you get a disparity in regards to some people who can't afford that to other people who can't. I mean, if my mom has to work 40 hours a week or 50 hours a week or is working 2 jobs, at which point she was, how does she teach her kid? And if she's making $18,000 a year, where does she get the money to teach her kid? I think those are problems associated with that thinking of that system entirely in terms
it's true.
of individuals doing
I want
education.
to interrupt you. Sorry, Jamarl, real quick. We have 5 callers. Our banks are literally full.
Oh, wow. We have 5 callers. Yeah, let's go to the callers.
Yeah, we got to get to
the
these
callers.
All right. First up, we have Daniel from Texas. Daniel, you're on the air. What's on your mind?
Yes. Sean, you were going on about in the last hour about how there's seemed to be no organization to these movements. And a man named John Potash has written about this, that people in high levels of power work consecutively to push these movements down every chance they get. A good example, and this is from Jordan Sheridan, and he was talking one of his YouTube segments about the Flint water crisis. One of the people was seen to be becoming the leader to fix the water system, and immediately they took him aside. They asked this person, they tried to relieve his sentence, or not relieve his complaints the best they could. And that's what this movement, that's what these people in power do. They try to squash these movements, and that's why you don't see real organization. And just like King got shot because he was actually going to lead to change, the system will try to shoot them before they actually get up. I know I'm sounding conspiratorial here, but
no, Daniel, I'm gonna get to this real quick. We have a bunch of other callers to get to, but I want to respond to what you're saying. First of all, I am not my dad. So you said Lee. I'm about half his age, 8 inches taller, a bunch of differences, including in politics. Also, my name is Shane, not Sean. But just with the organization stuff, I'll put it like this. I think that the grassroots movement needs more practical organization in terms of organizing policies. But I've also talked about how I'm worried about co-optation. I'm worried about these big organizations coming in. I will agree with your last point. I think that genuine movements that are genuinely critical, that actually have the capacity to seek change, those are, to make change happen, those are going to face the hardest pushback, the worst repercussions from the status quo, because of course they represent the biggest threat. That's why I'm a little bit, I don't want to get too much into my things. We need to go to callers, and I don't want to just sort of do the one-sided opinion thing, but that's why I'm a little bit skeptical about the current incarnation of the Black Lives Matter movement. I figure we should go to the next caller there real quick. Thanks for the call, Daniel.
Absolutely.
Up now we have Jonathan from Potomac. Jonathan, what's on your mind?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about or address the 14 so-called points that Biden's ahead. These are the same pollsters who got it wrong last time. I remember when the Donald was running for president originally, I said to people, I'm for the Trump, I'm for the Donald. I was laughed at, I was cursed, I was made fun of, whatever. Now, I'm physically threatened. I know of several people who have been physically threatened because they say they're for Trump. So if someone comes up and says to the average Trump supporter, who are you going to vote for? Many of them are going to say Biden because they don't want to be doxxed. They don't want to be harassed at work. This is like under Stalin. There's a KGB agent standing behind the pollster. Are you voting for Comrade Stalin? And again, I'd like to thank you for the first time I've ever been on Fault Lines to be able to finish my 2 to 3 paragraphs without being interrupted. That's all, sir.
Thank you for the show. Thank you for the comment. Shane?
I'm going to be honest. We have like 3 other callers. I'm a little bit frantic with calls. I'm
so
glad.
Let's just go to the callers. Yeah.
Feel free to call back in, Jonathan. We'll let you finish your thought. Just right now, we're real freaking busy. Jim from Philly. Jim, you're on the air. What's on your mind?
Yeah, hi, Jamal. I'm listening to you from the hard bastard. He likes you, and I like you too. But listen to this, okay? So I used to live in Society Hill, which is an affluent part of Philadelphia. And along there is called South Street. It's like the Strip. It's all these shops and bars and what have you. So I'm walking down the street one day. I see 5 cops around this old lady's car. So I make a smart-ass comment. I say, it takes 5 of you. I get 3/4 of a block. This black man that I never seen before in my life runs at me like he's going to hit me and stops 2 feet. I backpedal. He does the same thing. I go to jog across the street to get away from this lunatic, right into the arms of the 5 cops. Found out later this was an undercover cop when I filed a complaint. Yeah, so I get this black cop, right? He's like the ringleader. He tells me, if you move, I'm going to fuck you up. He goes over.
We can't. Wait. Yeah, we can't have
sorry.
the cursing on the radio show. I mean,
Jim. If you want to call back in, you've got to correct for that stuff. This is the FCC we're talking about. It's not us, not our prejudices. It's the FCC. Again, I think we'd become uniquely under pressure for any transgressions as a Russian-funded media show. So just please be careful about that. I'm sad to say, because of that little thing, and because we have 2 other callers in only a couple of minutes, I think it makes sense to go to John from Louisiana. John, you're on the air. What's on your mind?
Hey, Shane, just wanted to make a quick comment. You guys complaining about the fact that Democrats and Republicans have a monopoly. They really don't. You can vote green. And I hear a lot of people saying, we need a progressive party. We need to put all this stuff together. These people are talking about reinventing the wheel. It took the Green Party a lot of time and effort to get on most of the ballots in most of the states. And if people just change their mindset and decide to vote green, I think most of this stuff could be solved.
I think here's the thing. I kind of agree, but here's the other thing. There's also like the Libertarian Party. So it's not just that there's one alternative party, it's that there's a bunch of alternative parties. And I think it's partly through that diffusion of consensus. It's through all these different groups springing up. Again, it's a complicated thing because you want that. You want diversity of representation. But again, I think just the de facto, we are stuck with this 2-party system.
Yeah. So let's go to the next caller. Anthony from Detroit, if I'm not mistaken.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Good morning. Good. Just real quick, I just wanted to ask, I missed the first show, or I think it was maybe the second show. You guys, I think we're talking about the nursing home, that whole scenario. And I'm curious what you guys, if you know anything about Michigan in particular. I'm actually a candidate for state representative here, so I'm trying to this is really crucial me. And Governor Whitmer's, the rationale behind her and Andrew Cuomo, their decision to put the nursing home patients back into the nursing homes, because currently all of her statements are saying, oh, I was working with the data I had and everything, and that it made sense with the data they had. But that data, that, sanctimonious data, has not been revealed to us. And so we really don't know. I don't know what it is that has been driving that logic. So I'm just curious if you guys have any input on that.
Thank you, Anthony. We're going to take that call after the break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Welcome back. Come stay with us.
Fault Lines.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
So we are back with Fault Lines. Yeah, Shane, go for it.
Yeah, I'll go for it. Yeah, we're still working these kinks out. And because we're out of the studio, communication's a little bit difficult at points. But, hey, we're trying. On a radio show, I think. Regardless, we're joined now by Jareth Kopis. Jareth is the author of Ukraine Forever Upon. That is the title of the book. We've been talking about Ukraine a bit recently. We've also been talking about Browder and Magnitsky. It's sort of an associated story. Mainly I'm associating that because a couple of days ago when we had Lucy Commissar on, we were talking about the connections with CrowdStrike. Now, CrowdStrike, this whole thing about the server supposedly being in Ukraine, that's not the connection. But there are interesting connections between what CrowdStrike was doing with the DNC and Alexander Chalupa, who is, as far as I can tell, I'm just going to say this, a Ukrainian nationalist, descendants of people who were very involved in the Ukrainian nationalism movement. And so there's just this weird nexus of connections there. I just wanted to highlight for people who were just coming into this. Regardless, though, we're talking with Jareth about Ukraine. We're going to be talking about the Euromaidan, the history there, the color revolution that happened there, and potentially some resonances that color revolution has here in the States with what's going on now. But we'll get into that. That might be a little bit controversial. We're also going to be talking about Poroshenko and Biden, including playing some audio clips. But regardless, it's great to be joined by you, Jareth. How are you doing this morning?
Great. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. So I want to sort of set the stage. For one thing, it's great to have you on. We've corresponded very briefly online, but I think this is the first time we've ever actually spoken. So again, good to meet you. Thanks for joining us. And I just kind of want to go back to the beginning. So I'm not sure exactly where to start, but you have this history with Ukraine, a history of ethnic tensions that you've talked about a few times on the show between the East and the West. Then, and this is a huge jump because again, that history is hundreds of years old. Then in 2014, you have the Euromaidan crisis, effectively a coup that was backed by the U.S. We can get into the specifics there. And we're still living in the legacy of that crisis. Even the U.S., again, the impeachment of Donald Trump, the impeachment was centered on his correspondence with Ukraine. So it's interesting how central this is. But maybe starting with the ethnic tensions, I think that might be appropriate. Could you please help me to figure out, can you sort of help to set the table for this story and for what's happened here?
Well, sure. To really talk about it, you really need to understand the whole concept of color revolutions and structure, and essentially it's the new hybrid warfare that's waged across the world by all sides. So really, to understand it all, even before the ethnic level in Ukraine and everything, you have to look at color revolutions themselves. And the modern color revolution that I understand kind of started in 2000 in Serbia. It started with a group called Otpor. That's Otpor, Otpor. They were a group that were just a small, low-level group there in Serbia that were against Slobodan Milosevic. And the U.S. obviously didn't like Milosevic very well, and they sent in Ambassador Richard Miles and U.S. Army Colonel Robert Helvey to kind of take this group and work with them, give them different funding, give them different enlightening courses, they called them. I mean, Robert Helvey, one of the gentlemen that was sent in, was in 2 films. One was called Bringing Down a Dictator, and the other was called How to Start a Revolution. So these 2 guys really knew they had cut their teeth in South America and taking down governments, and now this was the first step into real Eastern Europe and taking down governments in Eastern Europe. So they put on seminars. One of the most well-known one was at the Budapest Hotel, where Otpor really, all their leadership was there. It's where they really gained a lot of momentum, was at this meeting with Richard Miles and Robert Helvey. They were taught how to organize working strikes. Communicating with symbols is a big thing. They used like the image of a rat, the image of a clenched fist, all the same things now you see in all the color revolutions. They were taught how to overcome fear by chanting, how to undermine authority, provided with over $41 million in the year 1999 alone for these types of things. And back then, when it was starting out, it was even in our kind of mainstream media. The Washington Post talked about it and were actually kind of negative about it. They said the U.S. Had funded so much to the level that they played a crucial role behind the scene in virtually every facet, from creating the parallel vote count to 5,000 cans of spray paint. So that was their quote, actually. They were bringing to light that we were spending a lot of money to create these riots and create these things and create this tension that ultimately results in the ultimate goal of color revolutions, which is the removal of a leader of a country that isn't Western aligned. They spoke with a number of different people about this. One of the main guys that sticks out to me is a U.S. Air Force officer by the name of Jack Duvall. He was a big proponent of Otpor, and he said that after the NATO bombing of Serbia, Otpor was really able to gain ground. So he almost validated the bombing of civilians that this group of supposed civilians was able to then take control after NATO had bombed Serbia. Moving on from Serbia, Georgia was the next target. Again, it started with a youth organization. The organization was called Kamara. One of the main leaders in this revolution that became known as the Rose Revolution was Mikhail Saakashvili. You guys may be a little bit well-oriented with him. He's been involved in Ukraine now, and he was educated in the West. He's a big-time connections in the West. He was the one selected by the previously mentioned Richard Miles. So Richard Miles from Serbia then went to Georgia, and he personally groomed Saakashvili to become this leader, and they were very successful in Georgia. And then after the end of the Rose Revolution, Saakashvili came to power and subsequent wars started. Moving on from Georgia, they thought they
actually, well, Jareth, I just want to interject here really quickly, because with Saakashvili, you're right, we have talked about him, and he's notable because, like you're saying, he was a Georgian politician, but then he went to Ukraine, and from May 2015 until November of 2016, he was the governor of Ukraine's Odessa Oblast, so basically a province on the coast there. Just an interesting thing I wanted to note real quick before you move on.
So you're all right there. Yeah, that's completely right. And he's actually up for more positions in Ukraine now. So he's very tied into all of this. Continuing on from Georgia, they moved on to Belarus. But in Belarus, they met some major competition with Lukashenko. I mean, you guys probably are aware of Lukashenko. He's been the ruler there since really the fall of the Soviet Union. He's a strong man. He has a certain amount of popularity there that's undeniable. And currently, that's been coming more into the news, and I've been keeping an eye on for these color revolutions to start up again because of things that are happening there, but that's an ongoing situation. But when they moved on to Belarus, they used a gentleman named Michael Kozak. He was the U.S. ambassador to Minsk, who tried to create a youth uprising similar to Kamara and Otpor. This one was called Zuber, but Lukashenko kept an eye on this from the start. He'd been watching the U.S. ambassadorship and everything for a long time and was very wary of them. And he was actually able to take this and bring it to light and show the people that what was going on. And he actually ran on this media outlet. He would go on and he would say, "We will not become the next target of the West." He openly talked about these color revolutions and was able to defeat it because he brought attention to it and the people were on his side and didn't want what happened in Serbia or Georgia to happen in Belarus. So those are if you really look at color revolutions, that's where it began. That's the beginning of the concept of this new hybrid warfare. And it's a very stringent form of warfare. It's not something that, this is where I kind of find it funny when people are saying that what we have in our country right now is a color revolution. I tend to disagree on this level because I think to be considered a color revolution, it has to have this pre-planned governmental, whether it be from the West, the East, anywhere, because all countries are using this against one another, these color revolutions. But it has to have a level of pre-planning and a level of inorganic start for it to really happen. Whereas here in the U.S., yes, there are people who have taken control of Black Lives Matter, taken control of all these different organizations. But I think fundamental movement for equality, not just racial, but class equality, has been a clear problem in the United States really for a long, long time. So I think, yes, there are watermarks that this is similar to a color revolution, but they got to skip a whole step. I think it's now just been taken over by the who initiate color revolutions, and it's a major boon to them. They got to skip the main planning phase and just go straight into the action.
That's very interesting. Yeah, point taken. I think that's valid, actually. Again, 2014, Black Lives Matter movement was founded. As far as I can tell, there wasn't some big shadowy organization, backing it. Where my mind would go would be the State Department, just because in all the cases you were just mentioning, they seem to be the chief agent pushing for these things. But again, clearly in the United States, again, there's a conversation to be had about co-optation, various things like that. And glad we're having that conversation. But just wanted to respond quickly to that. Jamal, anything you want to say?
So I do agree with the co-opting thing, and I do agree that this is not a color revolution. And so I think I've been the one on the channel arguing that basically this is a lot of people who've come together organically who are very angry at the way the system has treated them, and I still think the concerns are going to get broader. When people make this argument about a color revolution, though, why do you think they're looking at the United States as being right for this? Under normal circumstances, it's usually and often the United States that is basically funding this stuff around the world, whether it was in Ukraine and the plan that they put in to try to get them to sign over to a treaty that would have basically, for all intents and purposes, made Ukraine part of NATO, in name only. But also in South American countries, in Middle Eastern countries where we use proxies and these type of things in order to balkanize a certain area and expand from that balkanization to try to conquer the country. Why do they believe that this is taking place in the United States? I mean, who do they believe is backing this? And why do they believe that this is the same thing here?
Sure. Well, it's that saying that all empires return home, that you reap what you sow. So we've been doing this around the world for so many years that eventually, yeah, someone wanted to do it to us, but the conditions haven't been right for it. They haven't been able to create this fake uprising like they've done in so many other places. They haven't been able to go in and groom a specifically large enough group to make these type of large structural changes that they're seeking to do to our way of life. And they have that opportunity now. They have that opening, and not only because of coronavirus affecting everybody, but because of the already underlying general terms of unequalness and inequality in our country. So I definitely think there are characters now that are coming in and are looking to do the same exact thing as what is done in Color Revolution, but I don't see even their goal, I don't think, is to take Trump down. I think that's kind of silly and kind of short-sighted to think about Trump. Presidents really play no role in decisions. If you ask me, I tend to look 15, 20 years down the road, so I'm looking at the deeper state, the deep state, if you call it that. I don't know a better term for it, but the fact
let me ask you this. Do you think, and we have about 30 seconds left before we go into the next break, or a minute left, I'm sorry. Do you believe what do you think takes place, and do you believe that this has the chops to get systemic change in the society itself? Like, I agree with you, it's bigger than Trump, and I think Trump is just a symptom of larger issues that are kind of in the country Like, for example, you have a situation where the majority of the people that don't vote are under $30,000 a year. Now, I mean, basically, those are Democratic voters under normal circumstances. Those people have just stopped. They realize it doesn't necessarily help them. So when you're looking at this, what do you see down the line? Do you think the protests have the chops to get the change that they want in a systemic way, especially if those change and those concerns get broader into economic concerns? We have about 30 seconds left for a comment.
Sure. Quick comment. I'm pretty jaded when it comes to what I think about American protests and what I think our society can do. I think we need a lot of internal changes to our mentality, to our education, to the way we think. I think we're too focused on instant gratification, too focused on ourselves, not as thinking of the group, thinking of our society for actual big change to happen. I think we're going to get some token things such as police defunding and stuff like that, but stuff that in the long term really doesn't create much change, and people will go back to being happy for a while. It's the cyclical thing here in America of big time uprising, small time reward, and then back to comfortable silence until something else makes people upset enough to stand up.
That is the voice of Jareth Kopis.
With Thomas Stranahan. We'll be right back in a moment.
Fault lines.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
It's time to double down with Max and Stacy.
Yeah, double down. We're talking markets, finance, business, economics, ka-ching, bling, just about everything money related on Sputnik. It's called Double Down.
We're asking, are dead cats bouncing or have fundamentals changed? That's this week on Double Down.
Fault lines.
And we are back. We're joined now by Jareth Kopis. He's talking about Ukraine. We're talking about color revolutions. We brought it back home to the States for a second. I want to get back to Ukraine, though, because you set the stage. You laid out the precedents, the State Department's involvement in Georgia, Serbia, and I want to come back to Ukraine. Regardless, though, quick introduction for folks who don't know. Jareth is the author of Ukraine Forever Upon. If you want to check out his work on Twitter, you can also find him on Twitter at Rodion Press. That's RODION Press. All one word. Anyway, Jareth, I'll give you the hint on what we're going to be talking about with those clips. The first one is Biden and the State Department talking about Ukraine. Let me actually come back to this because I'm looking in my document for this thing. Regardless, though, we want to get into those. But you set the stage with the color revolutions. Can you sort of lay out what happened in the early stages of this in Ukraine? What happened before the Maidan and leading into the Euromaidan there?
Yeah, so there, before the Euromaidan, it actually goes back even before that to the Orange Revolution, which occurred in 2004. So since obtaining their independence in 91, because Ukraine actually obtained their independence before the Soviet Union was dissolved. A lot of people get that wrong. They actually became independent before the dissolution. So they didn't do it just because the dissolution. They actually became independent themselves. But from the start, their country was rife with corruption to a point where you wouldn't even understand. I mean, a lot of people are seeing that now. But through the 90s, it was just a mafia state, essentially. And people really, by 2004, had enough of what had become status quo. They were frustrated, upset with politicians, upset with really every level of the government, from the politicians down to state police, just like it is here. And the divide between the East and West became clear in the presidential election. It was between Yushchenko and Yanukovych. Yushchenko of the West, he's married to Catherine Claire Chumachenko, also known as Katerina Mikhailova Chumachenko, also known as Katerina Yushchenko, his wife. She's part of the Ukrainian diaspora in Chicago. She had worked in the White House with Reagan, with H.W. Bush. She's the vice president of a place called the Philip Orlok Institute for Democracy. That's named after a guy in the 1700s who used his military role to facilitate a secret alliance of Poland and Sweden against Russia. So that kind of gives you a general sense of where she's at. But she's tied in deep with the West, and she's married to Yushchenko. He's running, he's got the major support of the West. He creates a lot of alignments and coalitions with other groups in Ukraine because they have a parliamentary system. So to really defeat an incumbent, which Yanukovych was, he was the current prime minister, he was the favorite, he had a good deal of support. In order to defeat him, you had to form coalitions with other groups. So that's what he went about. So when it came to the vote, a major thing that Color Revolutions is a signature of Color Revolutions is the use of a thing called the parallel vote tabulation. So that's a methodological tool based on the collection of official results from small sampling of polling stations in a country. So our country and Western observers, they call them, go into these countries during elections and they take a small sample. It's like it's open polls. So they take the early polls and they release what they see, and they say they take the Western lined leader and they make it clear that he is leading. He's got a large lead. Yushchenko has this huge lead over Yanukovych. These parallel vote tabulations provided by Western organizations say it's a clear win. Yushchenko, don't worry about it. And then when the actual real results come in these countries, when normally people aren't aligned that way, and the results show that Yanukovych had indeed won, it laid the ground level for people to start saying, well, there must be something up if all these organizations were saying Yushchenko is going to win clearly. What happened? There's got to be voter fraud. There's got to be interference. So they use this to set the groundwork to either, if the Western candidate wins, they can say, see, we were right. If the Western candidate loses, they can say, oh, look, there was something wrong. So it's a tool that's used commonly. And I'm really interested in our election to see if that's used in this upcoming election, if we use the sense of the parallel vote tabulation. But that happened in the Ukraine in this election, and Yushchenko began saying, well, no, this is voter fraud. And people started coming into the streets. People were upset. People were frustrated. So they came into the streets. Yanukovych said he didn't want blood in the streets and agreed to a rerun. He was open to it and thought he could win it again because he had clearly won. And it was at this time that Yushchenko fell ill. And he initially was diagnosed by 11 doctors with food poisoning and put on bed rest. He quickly went back to campaigning quicker than what the doctors had told him. And he quickly got sick again. This food poisoning, he said he got while he was at a dinner with the head of the Secret Service of Ukraine. So he was kind of wary, thinking, oh, well, this could have been some sort of poisoning. He ended up running on that he was poisoned. So he got sick, and this time he went to a hospital in Austria. Now, he went all the way to Austria, and the doctors there said it was pancreatitis. And he had a viral infection along with this pancreatitis. They treated him, and he was released. And again, he went back onto the campaign trail before he should have. He was in apparently so much pain that they inserted a catheter into his back so he could be injected with painkillers on the run and on the go. So he was really pushing himself past his limit of what he should have been doing. And he got further sick, and eventually the story came out. He went back to the hospital, and now the story transferred into he said he was poisoned. And a big person who started to feed this story, this narrative, was his wife, Catherine Claire Chumachenko of the Western Alignment, and he progressively got worse. His face started to swell up. His left side of his face was paralyzed, and he was very grotesque to look at. So it was a really easy picture to share with the West and share with people to really get this gut check, this gut movement out of people to think, oh, there's an assassination attempt, a poisoning attempt. But the thing is,
Jared, we only have about 5 minutes left. I want to move up a little bit. I also think it might make sense to start playing some of these clips. The first clip we have to play that I want to bring up here, we're going to be talking about Biden making comments to the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations. But Andre, if we can play that clip, let's play that now.
I got all the good ones. So I got Ukraine. And I remember going over convincing our team, or others, to convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I'm not going to, or we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money.
So that, again, we played this on the air before, but that is pretty startling. That's him making comments basically saying, if you don't get rid of this prosecutor, we're not going to give you the money, and kind of bragging about it to the CFR. Now, this is a prosecutor. A lot of meat has been made out of the fact that this is a prosecutor who is investigating Burisma, the company that his son was on the board for. That has taken up a lot of attention in the United States, and that is significant. But there are some other aspects of this I also think are significant. Regardless, though, Jareth, what's your take on that? And maybe moving from what we were talking about, Yushchenko, moving into the Poroshenko regime, what happened with Yanukovych? There's a lot to cover there, but.
Yeah, so along with that is the tapes released by Derkach, the tapes between Biden and Poroshenko, the phone calls, which are really, really telling of the relationship those two had. The groveling kind of begging that Poroshenko, the subservient tone that he used with Biden was really kind of, it was troubling to listen to. But not only did Poroshenko give in to Biden on getting Shokin fired, Shokin had not one, not two, but 6 cases open against Burisma that he was investigating. So this wasn't a small thing. I mean, Shokin was deep into Burisma, so it was clear that Biden would not want Shokin to continue doing what he was doing. And I think I've talked about before who they replaced Shokin with. It was not a very good person. I think that was with Lee and Garland. But
an electrical engineer, right? Wasn't he an electrical engineer with no experience as a prosecutor?
Yeah, they had to change the Constitution to get him to be the new district attorney, or the new inspector general. So they had to completely change the way Ukraine was run in order to get him in. He had a bad history. He was a drunk. He was part of the extreme right. He had tried to break out 2 or 3 convicted criminals who were ultra-nationalists as well. They had plotted to blow up a statue of Lenin and were caught in the progress, and they were also found with child porn and weapons and explosives. But yeah, he tried to help break these guys out as well. So that's that guy's character. But continuing with Poroshenko, he also, not only that, but in the tapes talking to Biden, he also talks about how he imposed not the 75% tariffs on Russian gas imports that the IMF had asked for, but a 100% tariff onto Russian gas imports, as well as cutting subsidies to the poor and cutting funding and changing the role that pensions in the country were. So he removed pensions. He cut down on the amount people got for their pensions in Ukraine. And these 2 specific things were part of the reason why Yanukovych had walked away from the negotiation tables with the EU. These regulations have been very detrimental to Ukraine. They're getting worse and worse in the country. The people aren't getting paid their pensions. The people are losing money. Their gas rates are going up more. I mean, I think you guys have talked about how water cost in our country has gone up. Well, the price of gas to pay for heat there has gone up nearly 75%. So it's really, in the coming years, Ukraine isn't going to continue to do well. It'll look like it is because we're pumping in a lot of funding through companies like Google and stuff like that have been moving in. But that's all surface stuff. The actual people of Ukraine are really going to be hit hard by all these things. And that's what Yanukovych saw and wanted to change before moving into the EU, which kind of started the whole Euromaidan.
That's a great, I think it's a great place to leave off, and hopefully it brings us something to come back to, because we can talk about the future of Ukraine. Again, big problems, looming problems, like you're saying, economic in nature, but also driven by our geopolitics, by the United States' geopolitics. Regardless, great conversation. We were just joined by Jareth Kopis. He is the author of Ukraine Forever Upon, and you can follow him on Twitter at Rodion Press. That's Rodion Press. No spaces, nothing silly there. Thanks so much for joining us, Jareth. All right. And we're going to go into the next break here. We're coming back in about a minute and a half. We're going to have another fantastic hour coming to you. Notably, we're going over headlines in a few minutes here. Then at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, we're going to be joined by Danny Scherzen, where we're going to be with whom we're going to be talking about the history of the Korean War. As a lot of folks have been commenting on, we're seeing the anniversary of that war. Regardless, though, should be an interesting, disheartening, but still enlightening conversation. Looking forward to it. Another great hour coming up. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from just outside of Washington, D.C., the capital of the infected states of America. In the interdependent corner, I am investigative analyst and political theorist Shane Stranahan.
In the left corner, you have the ever-vigilant, indefatigable political analyst with a fetish for doing the news, Jamal Thomas.
A fetish. There we go. All right, get ready.
Salacious.
Get ready for the show that is the antidote to propaganda. We are both anecdotal and into data. It's Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, coming to the headlines now. Let's go over these real quick. Start off with the coronavirus. As I sort of indicated in my intro, we are the infected states of America. We are the world's epicenter of coronavirus infections in the world. Well, this has been continuing. This has been growing, in fact. In the last day, we've seen 41,000 new coronavirus cases, also more than 2,500 deaths. Just before the show, we were talking about this. Those deaths and hospitalizations are one of the key things to watch here, of course. That is the ultimate sort of result you're wanting to avoid. But also, there's been this whole conversation about tests, whether we're back up to testing capacity. Trump on Saturday at his Tulsa rally said that he had delayed testing, sort of ordered the halting of testing or the slowing down of testing. And then people thought that he was joking, but he said, no, that's what I meant. At least that's what I heard. We'll get into that more. But regardless, the deaths are coming in, sad to say. So 41,000 new cases in the U.S. in the last day. That has translated to more than 2,500 deaths. So that sort of lagging indicator has started to finally rear its ugly head. And I'm hoping that we make some changes to keep that head from growing and growing. Regardless, Democrats have passed a huge policing reform bill in the House. That bill was submitted by the Congressional Black Caucus, and sad to say that bill is probably going to fail in the Republican-led Senate. Symmetrically, Republicans were pushing a bill. Haven't heard as much about that in the last day. It seems like we're at a sort of a weird little halt there. We'll see what happens with those bills. I want to get more into those soon. Another story, the Trump administration has asked the Supreme Court to overturn the ACA, also known as Obamacare. With an 82-page document, the DOJ submitted that document to the Supreme Court, saying that the act, Obamacare, became invalid when the previous Republican-led Congress passed a law that would prohibit individuals from being fined for not having health care. It was one of the more notorious provisions in Obamacare. Some 40 million Americans could lose their health care as a result of the Supreme Court's proceedings. The head of the Center for Disease and the head of the CDC, I'll just put it like that because I briefly spaced on the full name, says that COVID cases may be 10 times higher than expected Meanwhile, the CDC has also expanded the list of underlying conditions that could put someone at risk of illness from COVID-19. Now included on that list are type 2 diabetes, obesity, pregnancy, also chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, COPD. A lot of people have that. So them expanding that list is significant. We'll see how that affects public opinion. Come back to that later maybe, but I'm just curious about that. Another story here. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled in favor of Trump that asylum seekers will have no right to a federal court proceeding. This is part of a wave of motions that, as far as I can tell, have made the process of refugees seeking asylum a lot harder. You can also look at this maybe from another perspective. Don't need to get too into opinions here, but the judicial system is pretty overwhelmed. I don't know. Maybe we should set up some better system for handling this stuff, some more streamlined system, but that's idealistic and we're in the news. Let's move on right past that idealism. A huge drop in humanitarian funding has a UN agency warning that millions of children in Yemen could be pushed to starvation over the coronavirus pandemic. 2.4 million malnourished children in Yemen, currently the world's worst humanitarian crisis. I also want to talk about that again in a minute. Second to last story here. Research carried out in Italy and Tunisia suggests the presence of microplastics in commonly eaten types of fruit and vegetables. Apples are the fruit most affected. Carrots are the vegetable most affected, according to this new research. By the way, we've known that microplastics have been found in fish and crustaceans. This is a little bit older news. The presence of microplastics in vegetables is new and disheartening.
That's what it was. Okay.
That's exactly what it was. Yeah, that's the thing. And I was reading a little bit about it right as we were going into the show here. It picks them up through the roots. So if you think about it, plants are based on the ground, of course. They pick up minerals through the roots. If there are microplastics in those roots, maybe they were left there by the wind. Maybe they were in chemical mixes that were brought in to fertilize the soil. I don't know. We should get somebody on to talk about it. Regardless, the plants pick those up through the roots, and then they're transmitted through the body of the plant, in some cases, apparently, into the fruiting body. So again, that's significant, something to watch out for. Definitely disheartening. Last story I want to get to here real quick. 3 members of the Wilmington, Delaware Police Department, those are Corporal Jesse Moore and officers Kevin Piner and Brian Gilmore, were fired on Tuesday after a department audit exposed a disturbingly sad and hateful of commentary between the coworkers, where they designated an African-American magistrate a, quote, N-word. I'm not going to say which N-word, but you can get the picture, in addition to a gay slur. Those are the headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right. Now we're moving into this interesting little liminal transitional period here. I'll put it like this. We can have a conversation, but I'm also going to put the number out real quick. We're having Danny Jerzan on at 9:30 for about the next 20 minutes, other than a break. You've got time to talk. You can call in if you want to. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. And that's 202-521-1320. Jamarl, just went over headlines. There's one thing I actually wanted to come back to. I want to get into the roots and stuff later. I want to get into plants because I'm interested in plants, interested in life in general. But we're talking about Yemen, and I'm going to go back to this because I didn't get into this. I didn't know how to put this part of it in headlines, but this is what else. I'm just going to read this again. This is how I wrote it, and I kind of wanted to make fun of it when I was thinking this stuff up before the show, but here's what it is. This is from the BBC. I'm going to quote. This is the headline as they're related. A huge drop in humanitarian funding has a UN agency warning that millions of children in Yemen could be pushed to starvation over the coronavirus pandemic. End quote. Now, what's left out of that headline?
Well, the war.
The war.
The war.
The war.
Yeah, the war. They were already on the brink of starvation because of the war.
That's the thing. We've been hearing about that for months, if not years now. And so anyway, I wanted to get to this earlier. I forgot to sort of mention it during the 7 o'clock headlines because I wanted to sort of copy it verbatim in so that I could comment on the obvious propagandistic nature of that, what they're alighting, what they're leaving out.
Yes.
That's just sickening to me, man.
It is. Obama greenlit that war. Again, New York Times, a day late, dollar short. It's always amazing to me that the New York Times would give a story, but they would leave out the context in real terms. Like they wouldn't put it into language that the public would look at and be like, oh, right, they're supporting terrorists. They don't just say that. They say it in these kind of odd ways. Or for this matter, in this very specific case, when Obama greenlit the Yemen war, where he understood that it was going to be blood-drenched, he understood that there was going to be problems associated with it, but he wanted to get Iran the JCPOA pass. And he believed that Saudi Arabia would create somewhat of a stink about it if he didn't necessarily support their, I guess, murderous attempt at attacking Yemen. The interesting
Is
part
that what it was?
Say that one more time.
No, is that what it was? Because here's the thing: some of the stuff I know decent. That's what I know decent. Some of the stuff I know decently well, but that story I want to look into more. If that's the case, if the whole Yemenis war, which again, what's the number here? 2.4 million malnourished children.
Yes.
If that was a bargaining chip for the JCPOA, which just a couple of years later Trump shot down, both sides of that are sickening. That's horrible.
And the United States is still helping Saudi Arabia in that war. I mean, we were doing airlifts, and then it was released accidentally that we had special forces that were going in basically doing raids and stuff. I mean, that war was utterly disgusting. They were indiscriminately, to put this in perspective, over the course of like a year, the United States in the bombing, I think it was in Afghanistan, and if I'm not mistaken, in other certain countries, we had 90-something% of people that we killed were civilians. That is astonishing. You're not even attacking terrorists at that point. You're just murdering civilians with every so often hitting a terrorist. In their very specific case, Saudi Arabia also had that murderous intent where they didn't necessarily care who they were bombing when they were bombing and dropping those bombs. They understood that those people were civilians and they just didn't care. And then Saudi Arabia also comes out and gives a blanket pardon to anything else that would happen in the country that would be considered war crimes. In advance. Like, so the fact that we've helped out in this is disgusting. And yeah, Obama, I mean, New York Times makes it very clear. He was sitting in the room. They had their conversations. Obama didn't want this to interrupt his JCPOA deal with Iran because, keep in mind, the JCPOA was considered a bargain, a compromise. From their standpoint, they thought that the very next step with Iran was a war. And anything short of that would have been somewhat of a compromise. So they had been working on this deal for years. And the JCPOA, when it came out, they thought this is going to stabilize relations between the United States and Iran, and that's worth this war, unfortunately. So we have a caller on the line. Let's go to the caller.
Joe from Virginia. Joe, you're on the air. What's on your mind, Joe?
How's it going, guys? So I was just telling a producer that, I recently discovered just yesterday about the whole fallout with Lee and Garland, and got a chance to go through like the library of podcasts to, figure out what they were talking about and, what was a big issue. And, I think in a lot of ways, the issue of abortion comes up. And, I was just looking at some of the stats, as far as what's reported out there about demographics and, as far as like the number of women that are, I guess like there's actually like a greater percentage of abortions that are white women and mostly in their 20s. And so, I'm a white guy that's 28 years old. And so this is really my generation that the bulk of abortions are happening, as the parents. And I have 4 kids with my wife. And, what I believe is that there needs to be like a moral revolution where there's a better support system. 75% of abortions are performed for women that are poor. And so we need to be able to support people better and provide an avenue where those children can, become part of our community and can be supported by people that have means. An adoption shouldn't cost $20,000. That's just kind of like an observation on the issue. I don't really have any greater thing than that, but it'd be great to be able to take care of our children as they come about and have healthy mothers and healthy children. And if a mother can't provide, then I mean, obviously this doesn't apply to every situation. There's obviously extenuating circumstances for some people and illness and things like that. But, it can be a very knee-jerk thing. But, there's like, 800, 900,000 abortions a year. I think the number was 185 abortions for every 1,000 people born. And, I just don't know if that's sustainable.
Yeah, quick clarification. Thank you so much for the call, Joe. Quick clarification for people who weren't listening the last couple of days or had dropped out or whatever. Abortion had to become a central topic. It had to do with race. Lee was talking about Margaret Sanger and eugenics, and it turned into this big thing. I'm not going to get too deep into that because I don't need to recapitulate that drama. It's not my business, and I have kind of my own take. But I kind of like where you were going with that. I think that it is a moral perspective. There are also economic sides of this too. Why aren't people having kids? Well, it's because wage stagnation. If both parents in the family have to work full time, if not more than full time, and they can't support kids, and or they have to save up for a long time to have kids, then you just have this delayed process. And I think, I don't know, something that gets lost and something that's so obvious that I think it's just why it gets lost. I don't think, it's not like people want to have abortions. It's sort of the side effect of these other aspects of the system. And you can have this moral conversation about abortions. I don't need to get into that trench because that's an old thing. But I think that you're looking at it from the right perspective. Nobody really wants that to have to happen. You know what I mean? People want, whether, again, this is a whole conversation about contraception, different ways of preventing abortions or natural family planning. And I don't need to get into that stuff. But I think, again, that's the sort of humane way to look at this. Nobody really wants this thing to happen. What we want is,
nobody
on the one hand, nobody wants abortion.
Yeah,
we want a good society. Exactly. Go ahead. Yeah, no, that's the thing. All right, you know what? We're going to go into a break right now. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. We're going to come back on the other side of this break, taking more callers. Feel free to call in yourself, 202-521-1320. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. We are still taking callers, and we are also, you can reach us, Thomas and Stranahan, at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. We were having a conversation, basically ended up somehow in abortion. But I want to kind of bring this to something that we also talked about, one of the headlines, basically about the plastics. Our behavior is killing us on this planet. Honestly, we need to reconcile that. Whether that's with poverty and the person, like he's saying, talking about abortions, that is literally death of sorts, in the kind of way of a zygote. But those are still issues of poverty, right? Those are also issues of infant mortality rates, children inability to learn what brain deformities from living in that particular situation. And this is not racial, by the way. This is across the board. Also, you have the situation with suicides, opioid abuse, these things, the diseases of despair that take place. But beyond that point, the things that happen on a larger society. For example, climate. The climate change issue is not just specifically about carbon being dumped into the atmosphere. That carbon also gets dumped into your plants, including the plants that we use to sustain and feed ourselves. And so you have a situation where carbon, I remember seeing this study and I thought to myself, oh, that is horrendous. Carbon is to food kind of like carbon dioxide. Basically, it's like a junk food. In small quantities or regular quantities, for the most part, that plant gets nutritious and provides you with your nutritional delights. When there's an abundance of it, it fills up kind of in the same way that we do with candy. And the nutritional content of it drops. Now, that's just one issue. And now we're finding plastics that not just in a fish, but also we have so much, like getting rid of these things and dumping these things in landfills, whatnot, that these things end up in our foods, just in plants themselves. Like, there's no way to really deal with this until your society reconciles and says, okay, eating plastic is probably not the best. And maybe we need to find a way to deal with the situation where we're not necessarily just doing this stuff of throwing things away, like this kind of planned obsolescence. Like, for example, you have a laptop or you have a cell phone or you have something else. Think about all the time it took for those materials in that cell phone to be mined, to be fashioned, to be created. Think of all the human labor that went into building it, creating it, thinking about it, coming up with solutions to the various problems. Think of the mechanical know-how that it took to fashion those minerals out of a mine into these electronics. And then we throw it away in a heartbeat. How weird is that? Like, it's so bizarre. We have a caller. I mean, yeah, it's so bizarre that we do that. Shane, I mean, you get into a lot of this stuff of finding technological solutions to this, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. That's kind of, I think, how I started my show. What do you think of that? I mean, basically, it seems like we're doing things around this planet that are basically not to the benefit of life and human development, but it's that somewhat the opposite, just cash and to the benefit of a few.
Yeah. I mean, so a couple things to say here real quick. Yes, pursuit of cash, it's also just a blind pursuit of power.
Yes.
Corporations will do this stuff just as easily as governments will when it suits their interests. So it's again, I don't want to get into the ideological thing about capitalism or whatever, but this is human nature, unrestrained, self-interested, and I think again that's the decline of political society. Political society, a polity, whatever, however you want to put it, this union of the culture and the political system, those should be restraining the worst excesses of power, to support the whole society.
Why?
Whatever that looks like. That is because I think that's the whole definition of it. I mean, okay, we have to get into political science for a second, or political philosophy. Political philosophy is distinguished from political science. This might be a little bit convoluted. Political philosophy has that normative thing built in. It has that must. It has that should, which says that the polity, your political system, is supposed to represent your interests, not just your interests. It's supposed to represent the interest of everybody in that society.
That's philosophy. We're dealing with the real world.
Well, that's the thing.
Right.
That's the thing. And political philosophy got transitioned into political science at one point. Political science, there's this whole thing about Max Weber and the Wissenschaft movement in Germany, and I don't even need to get into that stuff. But there's this transition from that normative take to a non-normative take, where it's this pure study, this pure analytics of politics, of the dynamics of politics. That's a big, long, convoluted thing. But I think that if we go back to that, if we come back to our values, it's clear that our political system should be doing certain things, and it's failing to do those things. I think that's intrinsically obvious.
I agree with you that it should, but the should is irrelevant. Ultimately, there is no God force that says people should do right or wrong. Right, wrong, good, bad, ethics, morality, those things are entirely tethered to the society to which they exist. And those things have changed over time. And even in the worst of those situations, there was nothing to stop it from taking place. I'm making the point that I agree with you that the government should do those things. But fact of the matter is, it's always relative. We're awash in these kind of relative perspectives, where somebody could legitimately say, in my version of the world and what I think should take place, government should leave me to my devices and allow corporations to get as much money as they want and be unaccountable, because it's in my best interest for it to do so. And people should fight for their own best interests, screw everybody else. How's he wrong? He's not. That's the problem, right? That we're stuck in subjectivity, whereas even though there's certain things that would benefit and better our society in regards to healthy human development, that point of healthy human development is not everybody's reason. Even though I agree with you that it should be, especially from the standpoint of the government. I think the thing that I want to impress upon you is that the value set is not in a vacuum. That the things that we consider human nature are not entirely just human nature. It's human nature in this system. There's a difference in those things. We can be in a competitive process where you have this capitalistic overlay where everybody is trying to get what they can get and people are fighting for scraps and everybody's in competition with one another. That's baked into the very system itself, be it in politics, be it in jobs, and be it in sports competition in the games that we teach our kids to play, because we want those kids to be ready for a real world that is competitive to its core. On top of that, you have other part of human nature that is compassionate, that can, if you nourish it and if you give it an overlay that allows it and incentivizes this notion of people working together and using those values that you talk about. I guess I'm making the point that the system itself, the overlay of the system to which people are grown into, incentivizes or disincentivizes certain value sets. And in our system, regardless of what we tell our kids, the very fact of the matter is that it's often a get rich or die trying. We deify wealth. We don't necessarily care how they get it. And what values arise from a system like that?
Well, I'm going to come back to this in a second. We'll continue the dialogue. I'll come back with something like a retort. But real quick, let's get the practical thing in the way. 202-521-1320. If you want to join this conversation, call in. Here's my take. The should does matter. And we were talking earlier about the idea that motivation is moot until it becomes momentum. I think shoulds matter in the exact same way. You have to have, we all do, it's not even a matter of having to have, we all do have our ethical sensibilities about what's right and what's wrong. It's, certain people, you call them psychopaths. Those sensibilities are very muted. But, for the vast majority of people, we have that. It's built into us. And there's this deeper conversation. You're talking about relativism. You're talking about whether should matter or what it even means for a should to. This is a different question, but what does it even mean that something like a should exists? That's again, a very philosophical question, but we're in that territory now. I'm not going to get too deep into that. Here's what I have to say. I was talking the other day about Erwin Schrödinger's book, What is Life? And he pointed this out, how life is a resistance to entropy. Life is this inversion of it. I'm taking it into my own terms at this point.
Do you think?
Here's the thing. What transcends the relative? What transcends, you're talking about relativism. One way of looking at that is nihilism. And there's this other idea that there are things that transcend that there are things that stand outside, that encapsulate that can make those relative positions make sense. That's a really open conversation. And I'll be honest, I think that we're entering an era where those philosophical conversations need to be had in the same way that 500-600 BC, we're going into what's now called an axial age. You had the rise of a bunch of thinkers in different parts of the world. You had Socrates, you had the Buddha, you had major developments, not just social developments, but sort of spiritual. You can consider them to be spiritual developments. I'm not a religious person. At least I have my own sort of set of beliefs, and they're kind of weird beliefs. I'm kind of getting into them right now. Maybe I shouldn't, but I think that we need something like that. This view of, again, for me, it's this view of life, this view of this growing, beautiful, sort of increasingly self-aware expansion that simultaneously has a purpose, doesn't have a purpose, and the way that you resolve that contradiction is that life is in the creation and the finding of its purpose, the best expression of what's latent there. I think that part of this is we've lost this conversation about human nature. How can you have a conversation about politics or what your political system should be like if you're not talking about the natures of the people that inhabit that system? If we don't have any perspective on how human beings are by default, ontologically or whatever, what we are like, and I don't see how you're going to get past that to a conversation about how we should act together, what we should be like in society together. I think we need to come back to that. I think relativism, that the perspective you're putting forward is part of that, because it's true in its own way. But I think that there's also some things that transcend that, and they come from the deepest levels of our being. And in a weird way, this is where it gets, again, transcendental. If our values are emergent from life, from the very fact that we are alive, well, life itself is emergent from entropy, from this universe. And that, to me, is the fundamental mystery. I don't know. I went through a bunch of stuff there. Some of it's spiritual, some of it's philosophical, a lot of it's political, too. Any response there, Jamal?
Yeah, well, we have a caller. I do want to connect it, but yes, I want to talk about that, because I think this is an amazing conversation. It takes the philosophy or the philosophical to the political in material terms. But we have a caller, Karen from Maryland. Karen, what's going on?
Hi there. I'm not going to change my questions just because I'm not dealing with the host from a couple of months ago. So we might not be able to take care of this today, and I accept that maybe you all will have to do some research on this. And incidentally, I'm welcome to the other hosts returning, whether that's realistic or not. My question for you all is, do you happen to know whether it's not, I think that you know that not everything makes the news. There's a lot of stuff that's left out of the news. So who knows, regardless of whether we've heard this discussed or not. Is there ever an audit done, AUDIT, ever an audit done of the federal government to determine whether it has excess employees or not, and how often is it done? I just wonder whether it's written into the federal law that there be an audit every so often of federal employees to determine whether all of them are, necessary, essential, needed, etc.
I'll put it like this. We have budgetary reviews that happen pretty regularly, but what you don't have is, like you're saying, an audit of the people. Now, there's this sort of self-defeating aspect. If you have a system that's auditing itself, and there are going to be a lot of forces in that system that want to get audited, that don't want to get audited. And so there's this perverse incentive. I think that's why it falls to us. It falls to people outside the government in a lot of cases to seek transparency and to try to push for that auditing.
Yeah,
that's my take.
I agree. I mean, like the government, it's like the government auditing itself. I mean, the thing is, the government is sovereign. And so to some degree, there is no other metric, I guess, to do it unless the government itself puts through the systems and infrastructure to do so. But I don't have the answer to the question. We have one more caller, Michael from Sydney. Michael, how's it going? About 1 minute for the call.
Yeah, hi guys. Yeah, sure. Look, I just wanted to pick up on what you're saying before. There's another important word, and that's could. Things should and could be different. Now, the state of nature is a very important conversation when you're talking about philosophy. What is the natural state of human beings before sort of like obviously Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, all those guys go under the state of nature. And Plato and Aristotle, for that matter too, they go under the state of nature. There's some very interesting concepts in philosophy as well. And I was always told in my first year of epistemology that the two most important words are should and could. Things could be different and things should be different.
Very cool. Thank you, Michael from Sydney. All right, we are going to take a break. We're coming back with Danny Sturgeon. You're not going to want to miss that. That's going to be an awesome conversation on the Forgotten War. Thomas and Stranahan, back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold. Catch all the breaking global political and economic news as it
Their main goal is to attack the Kurds. They're the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunday, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines, live from Washington, D.C. If you're in D.C., you can listen to us at 105.5 FM. And if you are in Kansas City, 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Shane and I are prodigious history buffs. Part of the reason Mrs. Tom married me, actually. So yesterday, June 25th, was the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, also called the Forgotten War, as it's often forgotten by the American population. Consider the level of indelible insult from a nation that inflicted deaths to the tune of 20% of their population, with the dropping of 635,000 tons of bombs, including 32,557 tons of napalm, and then not even remembering or caring that it happened. In real terms, the conflict, while intellectually forgotten, experientially continues to resonate with our relationship between North Korea and South Korea, in addition to the relationship between South Korea and North Korea. To discuss, we're joined by retired U.S. Army and former history instructor at West Point, Danny Sturgeon. Danny, welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Glad to do it.
So Danny, how does the results of the war influence our current political strife with North Korea, and for that matter, set the tone of the world itself?
Keep going.
Danny? Okay. Yes, Danny will be back with us in a moment. I'd like to make the point that oftentimes in the wars that we engage in, we take a perspective, and that perspective entirely ignores the strife and the other side of that conflict. Robert McNamara made the point that rationality needs to be tethered to something, that rationality is not always rational. Well, in this very specific case, whether this war was irrational or not, we forgot it. And in real terms, we inflicted a lot of damage and casualties. I would tell you this, North Korea has not forgotten this war. And much of the conflict that we have right now between North Korea and the United States is legitimate in regards to the distrust between these nations. The United States currently goes in with these kind of routines with South Korea in which they pretend to invade the country. North Korea has always said that is horrendous. If we or somebody else did that to us, we would be apoplectic about it. And Kim Jong-un has been apoplectic about it. So Danny, great, you're back. So Danny, how does the result of this war influence our current political strife with North Korea?
Well, first of all, the war never technically ended. And a status quo along the 38th parallel. And while, as you mentioned, most Americans forgot the war, forgot most of our wars because they happen 10,000 miles away and they don't really viscerally touch the American people, for the North Koreans, to some extent for the South Koreans, and for the lessons learned by many states that we consider rogue states or states that see themselves as weak and under threat from the United States, that war is very much alive. And we ignore the view from Pyongyang just as we ignore the view from, say, Tehran at our peril, because we misunderstand the motivations of the North Koreans and similar states. Why does North Korea see it to be so important to have a nuclear deterrent? Is it just because the Kim family is, out of control and, sociopathic, or all these different titles we put on them? I'm certainly no fan of the North Korean regime. That should go without saying. But one must understand that it goes beyond any individual leader, any individual system. And from the perspective of Pyongyang, the only sure way to make sure your country is not devastated, destroyed, has as many bombs dropped on it, as the entire Pacific theater in World War II, is to have that nuclear trump card. Because, of course, we saw what happened in terms of America invading and destroying North Korea during that war 70 years ago. But even in a more modern sense, from the viewpoint of any sort of, quote, rogue state, if you don't have nuclear weapons, like, say, Saddam Hussein did not, we see what America is capable of doing. And so that's why a country like, say, Iran or North Korea thinks that the only sure ticket to safety is some sort of nuclear deterrent. And thus we get the catch-22, where they become even more isolated and a perennial enemy.
That's
right.
The part
and
of this that's
Gaddafi.
worrying.
Oh, no,
that's
just saying Gaddafi. Yeah.
Yeah. And the part of this, I mean, what's like you're saying, we're driving them further into isolation. We're increasing the likelihood that there's going to be some at least a propensity for retaliatory moves. What I'm curious about here is, again, you have South Korea, you have Japan, historically foes, but they're both right there, and they are sort of the two chief U.S. contacts, other than Taiwan a bit further to the south, but they're right there. I'm just curious. I can't get into the minds of the leaders of these countries. This is a longer thing, but I'm curious what they think of what we've been doing. Because again, we've been working with South Korea on the like you were talking about earlier, various war games. We've been doing that for decades now, and so I could see them on the one hand sort of falling in line with that, because maybe it's keeping up in the military capacity that you'd need if there were something. But I could also see them being pretty frustrated with us for keeping that up for exactly the reason that you were talking about, that it's going to, make it more likely that the North Korean government is isolated, more likely that they're going to keep their nuclear weapons program up, basically keep this crisis, this long, slow crisis going. What's your take on that?
Sometimes when the United States gets involved in long-term military commitments, and 70 years of, having thousands of American troops in South Korea has got to be one of the longest in our history. The United States itself and its allies, like you mentioned, South Korea and Japan, end up actually becoming hostage to that military deployment. And so time sort of freezes at the Panmunjom Truce Peace Talks Conference of 1953 by virtue of having those American troops and thus the war games and the planning on the subcontinent, right, or on the peninsula. So I think that in some cases, depending on the president, depending on the moment, South Korea and Japan have become hostage to a certain extent and limited in their maneuver space to make a deal or normalize with North Korea by virtue of the presence of those American troops, by virtue of the fact that they both want to be under the U.S. nuclear umbrella, but also because of that become targets themselves. And so if you look at the political parties in South Korea and in Japan as they evolve over time, they often have very strong and opposing views on this issue, on how to deal with the United States, at what level to tie their foreign policy in. So depending on who's in power in those governments or in those states, there's doubt oftentimes about American policy and about whether or not it is a net positive for the U.S. to, have those troops there, conduct sometimes provocative war games. And, no, there hasn't really been an American president yet, for the most part, who has done very much to change that freeze frame, time capsule foreign policy, which has been our position in South Korea. So, yeah, I think that it's a complicated thing. And the current way, right, whether it be a Clinton or an Obama or to some extent a Trump, hasn't really solved the problem, has it? And one could say that about a lot of American legacy foreign policy.
It's the wild part. I've made the point. I had a conversation with a woman when our ad came on, and she went after Kim Jong-un. She basically said that guy's crazy. And I made the point to her that he's a rational actor trying to preserve the integrity of his country, something that you would too, but you never see the other side of that conversation. I mean, I keep saying we love our monsters, even though we look at other people and we don't give them the level of benefit of the doubt. For example, within the last 20 years, the United States took down Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and would have went for Iran if given the opportunity, if Syria would have fell. And these countries became basket cases. So he's not operating on this notion that that it's impossible for some kind of incursion. He's operating on this notion that this nuclear weapon preserves the integrity of this nation. How did it get to this point? What started the Korean War?
Well, I mean, the Korean War is often seen as maybe the first bloody or key flashpoint of the early Cold War. So for the most part, it's viewed within the Cold War lens. And to a large extent that is true. But actually the context and the backstory goes a little further. So 1950 is 5 years after the surrender of the Nazis and Imperial Japan. But the reality is that Korea had been a tool in East Asian imperialism for quite some time, under the control of China and then later under the control of Japan. But, when the United States kind of wins that war in the Pacific, folks forget that the Soviets, as promised, although late and sort of weakly, entered that war in, the last week or so of the Second World War in August of 1945. And the end state, the very tenuous end state, was Soviet occupation of the northern end of the Korean Peninsula, which had been under Japanese occupation, and then the United States under the southern end. And one must also understand that a year before the Korean War, and oh, by the way, the Korean War never happened, most likely, if this had not occurred, China, is, quote, lost, right? That was the terminology. We blamed everyone within the U.S. government. Who lost China? Of course, the assumption there is it was ours to lose, right?
Right. Yeah.
At that point, there is palpable fear within the U.S. elite kind of mainstream governing structure that the world is about to go communist, and yet there's still hesitation about what to do about it. Containment has not been fully formed, despite Kennan's telegram having come through, kind of laying out the contours of it. So there's a speech given, by a key, I think the Secretary of State, basically laying out what the key defensive perimeter of the United States is, which countries we're going to defend, and Korea is kind of left off that list, either on purpose or not. And, it's seen as sort of a green light for the communist leader of the North, Kim Il-sung, to invade the South, right, to sort of unify the peninsula, and got largely both Stalin and Mao's kind of go ahead to do it. And I believe it in that June there's 50 years ago today, right, there's the invasion, which then sets off the American intervention, which is to some extent and in reality couched under a UN intervention with a whole lot of like Turkish troops, for example. So, that's the general backstory. It goes from there, and it gets bigger and bigger when the United States, as it's wont to do, gets grandiose ideas after some early success, and decides to take the war all the way into the North. So instead of just defending the integrity of the South, tries to, reunify and do a regime change in the North, at which point the Chinese come in and, oh, by the way, we almost get the world war we've been so worried about. So it gets
Let's talk about that after the end of the break, because that gets into a really interesting story. We're speaking with retired U.S. Army officer and former history instructor at West Point, Danny Surgen. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Yo! Deshaun, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean? You're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
We continue to be joined by retired U.S. Army officer, former history instructor at West Point, Danny Sursen. So, Danny, please continue. You were getting into and this is Thomas and Stranahan, of course. You got into the really interesting part of the story that I really wanted to get into. If I'm not mistaken, MacArthur gets ideas of going and invading the other country, basically what you're saying, taking over. The president at the time flips out. Now, the president reads him the Riot Act because the president, not wanting a war with China, made it very clear that you weren't to do this. And if I am not mistaken, even reprimanded him for this. Am I correct in this? Am I remembering this correctly?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, one of the most famous biographies of MacArthur is called American Caesar. And there's a reason for that. He's one of the more political and powerful generals in American history. He's got grandiose ideas, and he's very independent. He's a national celebrity and always like one of these perennial presidential hopefuls. And, he's out there having been in charge of the occupation of Japan and like the reworking of their society in many ways. And, finds himself in his, third major war and decides, largely outside of orders, to go past, although he does get initial approval, but to go past the initial UN mandate of sort of, reestablish the borders of South Korea, kick the North Korean army out, to let's invade North Korea and end this thing once and for all, kind of like those folks said after the first Persian Gulf War, right? Let's go to Baghdad and end this thing. Well, he gets a lot of intelligence. MacArthur, I went to West Point, and he's got statues and barracks and just about everything named after him there and all that. But actually, the guy's military record is highly checkered, and his political record is disgusting. But he's getting all this intelligence that says, look, the Chinese are coming in this war, and they got a lot of folks, right? If you go over the North Korean border, and definitely if you go towards the Chinese border, and his guys even capture some Chinese infiltrators, some early scouts, and he kind of ignores it. Goes straight up to the Yalu River, dividing China from North Korea, and presto, in comes 300,000-ish Chinese troops, and almost destroys MacArthur's army, right, which is largely saved by General the mid-level and heroism. So at that point, MacArthur freaks out and says he wants to fire nukes, at China. Wow. And maybe the Russians too. So it really becomes a civil military crisis of the first order, and Truman does in fact fire MacArthur over some interviews and letters that he writes to Congress outside the chain of command. But the thing to remember, final point here, Americans love a good general, and huge portions of the American public supports MacArthur in his madness, and the way he's welcomed back after being fired for wildly going outside the chain of command and being a madman is with a ticker tape parade in New York City and an address to Congress. So this is that's the final act of the story no one ever really talks about.
That's
Actually, so
I
I'm
always
curious-
thought that was go ahead. I always thought that was the most fascinating part of that story. Go ahead, Shane.
Totally. I'm curious about how Eisenhower ties into this. So Eisenhower came into office in 1953, obviously, like you were just talking about generals, very prominent general, 5-star general in World War II. I want to look back into Eisenhower's administration because that seems pivotal in a lot of ways. Mid to late 50s, a lot of stuff going on there early on in the Cold War. And of course, Eisenhower is well known among members of the audience of the show for, in his closing speech, talking about the military-industrial complex. But going back to 1953 and preceding that, before he became president, can you tie him in? Again, I'm just curious where he came in, what his perspectives were at the time.
Well, Ike and MacArthur, their career, MacArthur's older. MacArthur's he graduates West Point like 15 years before Eisenhower, but their careers are very much throughout his early and the middle part of his career. Eisenhower's like the number 2 to MacArthur for many years, both in D.C. and then in the Philippines. And Ike doesn't really like MacArthur. He finds him to be just pompous and, obtuse in a lot of ways and a nightmare to work for. And so Eisenhower had been like the president of Columbia University during the late 40s. And when he decides to run for the Republicans, it's forgotten that he's running, not unlike someone like John Kerry or whatever in 2004, although important to remember that Eisenhower is a Republican. He's running against an unpopular stalemated war, and he largely gets elected under the promise that he will, quote, go to Korea, right? He's going to go there, he's going to physically show up, and he's going to end this war. He's going to bring it to some sort of honorable close. And it's important to remember that. And it's also important to remember, I'm a fairly progressive guy and, make no bones about it, but I try to be intellectually honest about it. In many cases, in America's post-World War II conflicts, the Democrat sort of starts the war. And in fact, it takes almost a Nixon to China or some sort of realist, conservative alternative to end it. Now, that's a simplification, but that's kind of how Ike comes into it. And a piece is kind of crafted very early in his administration. There's a lot of talk about maybe he did a little bit of a Nixon madman theory, but more quietly, where he talks about maybe, you better watch out because when Ike comes in, he might escalate in order to end it. But nevertheless, he does bring this war to a close. And if you look at the rest of Ike's administration, the proceeding 8 years, despite a lot of nefarious coups and awful things that do happen under Ike, he actually avoids purposefully the large-scale intervention of U.S. troops in overt wars. And it seems that Eisenhower took a certain lesson from the Korean War, that it is better to work through the shadows and Mr. Dulles at the CIA than it is to get involved in, a land war in East Asia, to kind of quote from the Princess Bride movie in the 80s, right? That's madness to get involved in a land war in Asia. So, Eisenhower was not thrilled with and not amused by MacArthur's antics, and didn't have a lot of use for that stalemated Korean War. So I think that the war does inform Eisenhower's moving forward. And the military-industrial complex, which he does, of course, warn about at the end of his 8 years, gains in power and influence, I would say, more and more quickly due to and during the Korean War than perhaps at any time in American history. And Ike does sort of realize that, at least by the end of his 8 years.
That's significant. Thanks for that, Danny.
Yeah, that is so cool. I am so fascinated by this stuff. So what was it like in North Hong Kong right now? Many of the people in Hong Kong are pushing for this pro-democracy movement. And they're often using like the British or American flags. And I often want to point out that Hong Kong was stolen, and that the regime you lived under with the Brits wasn't necessarily a beacon of freedom and democracy. When South Korea was basically occupied by the Allies or by the United States, what was life like under the South Korean government with the United States in charge, as opposed to what was life like in North Korea?
Right. So a lot of people read back into the past based on the present of South Korea, the present being, relatively effective democracy, rich country, great technology and quality of life, all this, right? So we take the present, we read it back into the past, and we forget the, inconvenient fact that, like most of America's military interventions since, VJ Day, right, since 1945, the client state who we purportedly were defending was actually, for the first few decades of its existence, rather authoritarian and undemocratic. So life in South Korea in, say, the 50s or even well into the 60s is not that much better than North Korea, right? It's not a complete binary of like light and dark, democracy and authoritarianism. South Korea only haltingly and slowly makes its way towards something resembling what we would consider, say, parliamentary or representative democracy. So, the South Korean story works out pretty well compared to some of the other American clients, but it's often forgotten that we were backing one authoritarian regime against another, and also that the Korean War is more than an American force-on-force, trench lines and bombers war. It's actually very much a Korean civil war, in that there's fighting behind the lines, and there are guerrillas in South Korea, and there's a whole lot going on there. And America really, as it is typical to do, takes sides in a civil war. So, this was not ever as clean as it is easy to kind of read back as though it was.
Danny, this is Shane here again. Thanks again for joining us. I actually have a pretty broad, kind of all-encompassing question, just for people who are wanting to learn more about this, myself included, myself first in mind, in fact. What books would you recommend that we read? Or if not books, I'd love book recommendations too, but websites, films, documentaries, anything that's been of interest and significance for you that's informed your opinion about this.
Yeah, so, there are, from the perspective of, say, the Army, there's always the book that every soldier and officer reads, which is, Fehrenbach's book. I can't remember the title of it. It's pretty easy to look up, and there's like a very much military focus. The Army was unprepared for this war and all that. But I think in general, one needs to take a look at the documentaries and the books that take a broader look at U.S. policy and the military-industrial complex. We're talking about, Hogan's Cross of Iron. We're looking at Mike Sherry's book on the early Cold War. there are plenty of interesting books and multi-volume sets on the tactical aspects of the war itself, and that's interesting. But I think the Korean War should really be looked at more in the broader Cold War sense. So, other great works, I can go on and on, but, Ard Westad's Global Cold War, and then also his newer book, just the Cold War. Anything that places Korea's conflict within the broader look of the early Cold War and why it happened and the outgrowth, that's, I think, in general, the important stuff. And then a final one I would mention would be anything by Melvin Leffler, Spectre of Communism, Soul of Mankind, and these things. But one must place it in its context, because when we don't, a lot of Americans love reading history books, like to read the narratives of war, and that's great, but those things are usually, they deceive as much as they kind of illuminate, and I think you have to be careful about that.
I think you're right about that. That was the voice of Danny Scherzen. Great guest, frequent guest. I'd love to get you back on soon, Danny, to continue this conversation and have many more. Regardless, though, Danny is a retired U.S. Army officer and former history instructor at West Point. Thanks so much, Danny, for joining us. Again, great conversation. And that brings an end to another great show and an awesome first week. Got to say, it's been a lot of fun, Jamal, getting into increasingly interesting conversations.
And we were saying the same thing. Fantastic conversations. Love it.
Real quick, I want to just throw a shout out. Michael from Sydney, we didn't get time to really respond to you, but you were bringing up Hobbes, Rousseau, deep philosophy stuff. Call back in sometime. Maybe we can talk about it again. But regardless, we'll be back on Monday. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, this was another phenomenal show. I am digging this like nobody's business. The guests, I wanted to have this conversation because oftentimes our society, our life, is framed within the context of history that we often know nothing about. Like, we pop into this reality frame. And while we're into this reality frame, we grow up and we get certain values, certain ideas, certain understandings of the world. All of that stuff to some degree is imposed in us. And as we go through our life, if we're fortunate, we're able to exceed it, to at the very least make some kind of decision on what we want to keep versus what we want to leave behind. But oftentimes, people don't necessarily get that choice. And so those people, all of us, have to learn and almost are thrust into this position of having this kind of blank slate that we need to dig into to figure out why is our world the way our world is. And until you know the history of it and how it propagated, it's almost like this large hammer hitting something with a resonance that perpetuates through history. It's hard to put it in context. The Korean War is called the Forgotten War. The United States killed a fifth of that population. Napalm and bombings. It's astonishing. We forgot it. Now, I guarantee you they did not. And because they did not, a lot of what we deal with today is something that they understand that came back from that war. The fact that we don't remember it makes it that much more difficult to deal with them and understand their particular point of view. Whatever you want to think of North Korea, he is a rational actor in the sense of wanting to maintain the integrity of that country, not to mention his own life. And he's seen what happened to Gaddafi, he's seen what happened to Saddam, two of which friends at one point of Western powers. So I love that segment. I just wanted to put that stuff in context. We've had some really good shows this week, and I really do appreciate all of you for joining us for these shows. Shane, Raheem, our producer, great job. And they've welcomed me into the team in this kind of, since I am basically the odd man out and coming on. But no, great show, great week. Fault Lines, Shane, Thomas, and Stranahan. Like, share, and of course, subscribe. Thanks all. Oh, we have comments. So, Chet's mom, thank you. I appreciate it, Chet's mom. What about the constitutional amendment to get money out of politics? Wolfpack has been going through the states, and Democrats and Republicans of the state level are supporting this. Wesley Walker, thank you, Wesley. Leave a comment, Wesley. Leave a comment. So, from the standpoint of this, the constitutional amendment, I have to be honest. That makes me sketchy. That makes me terrified. Republicans are pushing for this for a balanced budget amendment. Now, a legitimate argument can be made that the Constitution can't be opened, meaning for a national convention, that it can't be open, it can't be mangled with. outside of the confines of the specific statement to which they're engaging. So that's the argument that basically Cenk makes, that no, you can't open this for any and everything. You have to have enough people supporting it and it has to be very specific to the issues. I don't trust that. By all terms, Merrick Garland, if that was true, should be sitting in the Supreme Court right now. Rules and policies are changed based upon the whims of the people who are in power. And it can be, to some degree, unaccountable. And I guarantee you this, whatever the results that happen out of that will be instantiated with nobody doing anything about it. Think of for the moment of the elections. You have Sanders, who clearly was cheated in 2016. Didn't matter. You have a situation where one precinct in Kentucky is open. It's the fig leaf of a democracy where in real practice, they can do things in order to make that process worse. Whatever the results of that election, you think that the fact that they cut all of those precincts down to one in any way is going to add to change whatever the result is? Or in these other places, John Kerry not contesting the results in Ohio, Hillary Clinton not contesting the results in Wisconsin. I'm making a point here that despite some malfeasance that takes place, just because there's some malfeasance doesn't necessarily mean there will be a consequence for that malfeasance. It doesn't necessarily mean that something will come in to stop that process from taking place. And I would say decidedly the opposite has been typically true. You have international law. Is it really international law if the United States can kill 500,000 people by intruding in Syria? Where does that fall in? Even in Bolivia with Evo Morales. Evo wins that election by like 10 points. To put this in perspective, imagine for the moment if Sanders ran against Trump and beat Trump by a 10-point spread. That is unheard of in American politics, at least in modern terms. And yet that's what was happening in Bolivia. That's how popular he was. That in no way stopped the forces of that country from getting rid of him, having a coup, take him out of office. And for that matter, basically he's living in Mexico right now with his life under threat. Is what happened to Julian Assange. Was there any process to stop the unfairness in that way we dealt with him? No, there wasn't. Nothing. So there's nothing in me to believe that there is something outside of ourselves that is going to be somehow a savior to us. And the institutions that are supposedly there to do that has fallen down miserably on the job because in a weird way we think our institutions are magic and that they don't necessarily have to be with this kind of vigilante focus in ensuring that those politicians do the job and those institutions are living up to the standards to which we expect. When that falls apart and that goes into disrepute, it's a madhouse. I want money out of politics. I want a constitutional amendment to do so. So no misunderstand me. I would prefer that go through the legislature. I am very dubious, or at the very least have great qualms and concerns about it going through the notion of a constitutional convention when the Republicans and the Democrats get to basically open up the mechanics of our government and set the framework and the spine to which we will all be accruing around. If I thought we had more honest actors, I wouldn't have an issue. I do not think we have honest actors. I'll end this here. Like, share, and of course, subscribe.